Welcome back to the European Market Open. A minute to go until the start of cash equities trading. Here are your headlines. Joe Biden is sworn in as the 46th President of the United States. He pledges an end to what he calls an uncivil war. Decision day, ECB President Christine Lagarde says Europe's recovery is on track despite repeated lockdowns. That as Germany's virus deaths pass 50,000. And Citigroup cuts bonuses for dozens of its top executives after being reprimanded by US regulators. Matt?
All right, let's take a look at futures this morning. Higher across the board. Whether you're looking in Europe or the US, you do see gains even after new record highs on many of these indexes. Not the FTSE, of course, but it's up as well. DAX futures, FTSE futures, CAC futures, all up about 0.5%. So as European markets open up, let's take a look at the global macro movers screen. And here you can see the equity indexes in the left-hand column. The FTSE, the first to open, really little change there. But you can see the IBEX now popping open up 0.5%. And you'll start to see other continental European indexes open higher. And these are moving higher as well as we watch them. So the FTSE now up 0.3%, 0.4%. The DAX coming out of the gate up 0.6%. And the CAC 40 also gaining about 0.6%. This after Joe Biden was sworn in as the 46th President of the United States. In his inaugural speech, he pledged to reset the tone in Washington. Then it was down to business, heading to the White House to sign 15 executive orders to unwind Trump administration policies from immigration to climate change, as well as enacting some of his own agenda. Joining us now is U.S. Editor Kathleen Hunter. And Kathleen, I have to admit, it's a little bit funny. You know, to watch the inauguration, and I thought it was fantastic. It was all about unity and bringing the country back together and, you know, representing both sides of the aisle. Then he goes back to the White House and undoes everything Donald Trump did. So what is it really about?
Well, I think that there is kind of a question of substance when it comes to policy and also a question of style and, you know, how the business is conducted. I think that, you know, in many ways, Joe Biden yesterday in his inaugural speech was speaking to the latter. I don't think he was necessarily saying that he, you know, endorses the policies of Donald Trump's administration or that he, you know, he certainly had made no bones beforehand about the fact that he was going to do those executive orders. So, you know, on one hand, I think that it definitely is in keeping with, you know, the types of issues that he campaigned on, and I think it would be unrealistic to expect that he, or inaccurate, I guess, to expect that he would not try to roll back or, you know, take the country in a different direction policy-wise from the one Donald Trump did. But at the same time, I think that, you know, part of your point, Matt, is that, you know, there's going to be that kind of healing, you know, breaching this partisan discord that has really infected Washington to a severe degree is going to be easier said than done. And I think that, you know, when you start looking at policy specifics, that's what we're kind of, you know, seeing is that there still is a lot of disagreement and a lot of daylight between the two parties when you get down to actual issues.
Yes, and whether he has the ability, so talked about, to work across the aisle, Kathleen, that he really can manage to govern for all and at the same time deliver the more radical elements of his agenda. We'll wait to see how that develops. In terms of executive action then, he got down to business straight away. For the global audience, what do you think is most relevant? I mean, and going into Paris, it wasn't a surprise, but perhaps for many in Europe, comforting to see the confirmation that the US is really changing tack on climate.
Absolutely, and that's, I think, what I was going to point to is really the you know, rejoining of the Paris Climate Accord. Him doing that on day one, I think, is really intended to send a very strong signal, not so much domestically, but, you know, internationally, that, you know, that the era of Donald Trump, who had this America First policy, was very inward-looking in his foreign policy, didn't trust multilateral organizations, you know, really limited the U.S.'s role in everything from the WHO to the Paris Climate Accord to the Iran nuclear deal. I think Joe Biden's sending a strong signal globally here with his move to rejoin Paris, and I think that is, meant to try to help ease concerns overseas and send the signal that the Trump era is over.
All right, Kathleen, thanks very much for joining us. Our U.S. editor, Kathleen Hunter, there talking about the 46th president of the United States. Joining us now is Morgan Deldon, Global X ETF's Director of Research. And Morgan, let me first ask you about what kind of changes Joe Biden's policies are going to make in markets. I mean, how can investors take advantage of, for example, we saw, people already getting into clean energy as he starts to sign these executive orders?
Exactly, Matt. So we're seeing it as a bullish signal for other sustainable investments, but like in clean technology, renewable energy, but also electrical vehicle and all the battery technology behind it. And another sector that will benefit from the new administration in the United States is certainly the physical and digital infrastructure, including 5G, but also broadband across the country. So I think it's a domestic boost and an international boost for ESG-related themes.
Yeah, and good morning to you, Morgan. I wanted to ask you about where you see those ETF flows then, in particular around climate. EV, electric vehicles, clearly a big theme. Have you seen investors more willing to get involved in companies that are playing catch-up rather than the pure plays in that space? Is it about investing actually in maybe some more traditional automakers and their suppliers that are doing well on EVs?
Well, the whole point about thematic investing, and I think it's why it's so successful, is the fact that it is pure play, and investors want to have this pure exposure to the companies that will benefit the most from the realization of these mega trends, the structural trends that are happening. And one of them, as you just mentioned, Anna, with electrical vehicles and the lithium, we're seeing investors really increasing appetite for these strategies, because when you think about lithium today, electrical vehicles account for about 50% of the demand for lithium, but we do expect it to rise up to 90% by 2030. So an enormous high growth potential, which work particularly well in this very low interest rates environment.
What are the headwinds you expect? I mean, Donald Trump, when he was talking about his accomplishments yesterday at Andrews Air Force Base, he said he was more proud of the deregulation even than the tax cuts. And a lot of these steps are, as we speak, being reversed by Joe Biden, of course. He's going to bring a lot of regulation back. He's probably going to at least start the discussion on hiking taxes, and there could be pressure on bonuses as well as dividend payments.
Well, we do see a continuous support from monetary policy in the United States and in most developed countries, and also the fiscal stimulus Joe Biden unveiled recently is giving a boost to equities, especially growth over value and risky assets. So we don't see a dramatic change in market conditions, and we do think that this environment is still positive for equities, at least as long as the stimulus is there. We don't see any reversal in the current trend.
Yeah, let me ask you about that growth versus value. I was looking at a chart that one of my colleagues prepared about earnings and the lack of earnings in tech businesses and the way that just doesn't seem to matter. Shares of money-losing US tech companies have really soared during 2020, of course, as we know, Morgan. Do you expect that to continue?
Well, when you look at of course, at the PE and valuations by traditional metrics for tech stocks, then it can look expensive. But actually what we look at and what we focus on, and we believe it's the right way to do, is to look at the future growth sales. And when you deflate the price by the expected sales growth, then they do value in line with the broader market.
When you think of ETF investing, and I'm just thinking about this because it's grown so much. Initially, we all thought of this as a way to avoid active managers, and you could buy baskets and track indexes, but really you can actively manage your portfolio with ETFs.
Well, Matt, it's actually extremely true. The growth in the European market, for instance, is absolutely enormous. Like the assets double in the past 2 years. We do expect them to at least double or triple over the next 3 to 4 years. So we are extremely positive on the European ETF market, especially with the growth of thematic investing. Thematic investing is really a satellite approach. I wouldn't say that it is active, but it does offer investors an alternative way to invest in these structural trends that are really hard to fully capture with a traditional asset allocation framework and at traditional sectors. So it's an easy way and single trade to get exposure to these mega trends.
Morgane, thank you. Stay with us. Morgane Deldon, Global ex-ETFs Director of Research, stays with us on the program. Coming up, President Christine Lagarde struck an upbeat note about economic growth last week, but as the ECB holds its first policy meeting of the year, will her outlook remain the same? We'll discuss next. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Markets. This is the European Open. We are 13 minutes into the session and looking at a 1% gain for the automakers. The banks are up almost 1% as well. That's boosting the Stocks Europe 600 index, the broader European benchmark, by about 2/3 of 1%. So looking at some pretty decent gains here in Europe. Let's get the Bloomberg Business Flash. For that, we go to Laura Wright in London. Laura?
Thanks, Matt. Citigroup is cutting bonuses for dozens of its top executives. Sources tell Bloomberg the reductions will vary widely, and some of the final decisions have not yet been made. The cuts are due to the bank being reprimanded last year by US regulators for failing to maintain proper risk management. No comment from Citigroup. Unilever is aiming for a tenfold increase in the amount it spends with suppliers owned by ethnic minorities. By 2025, it wants to spend €2 billion, just under 7% of its sourcing budget, with diverse suppliers. Unilever also wants to ensure that every person on its supply chain is earning at least a living wage by 2030. United Airlines wants to top its pre-pandemic profit margins by the end of 2023. It's mapping a path to recovery after last year's record loss. The carrier sees this year as a transition after the collapse in travel demand due to coronavirus. United says it's more than halfway to finding $2 billion in cost cuts. That's the Bloomberg Business Flash. Matt, Anna.
Laura, thanks very much. Laura Wright in London. So ECB policymakers are facing an economy gripped by the virus as they hold their first meeting of the year today. President Christine Lagarde said last week the central bank's economic growth projections are still, quote, very clearly plausible, but her upbeat tone is increasingly threatened by stricter lockdowns and a slow vaccine rollout across the region. Morgan Del Don, Global X ETF's Director of Research, is still with us. Morgan, for somebody who focuses on ETFs, I wonder how you look at the ECB. Many don't expect much change in the amount of support provided to the economy today, but I wonder what relevance you give to conversations around the amount of support the ECB is going to come forward with. What are you looking for?
Well, we don't expect much from this meeting in terms of new information, but definitely a confirmation that the ECB will continue to provide support across the region, especially in market conditions and financing conditions for across all the Eurozone countries. We do think that accommodative monetary policies in Europe and elsewhere will continue to increase interest for risky assets, especially in the emerging market space and China. So we do think that investors will look for yield in the emerging market space.
Is it risky? I mean, how far out the risk spectrum are you going here, and how important is the dollar move to those yields?
Well, first of all, yes, China has outperformed the US last year, and we are seeing some sectors are performing better than others, especially in the IT space, in the consumer discretionary and healthcare in China, due to the rise of domestic demand with the emerging market middle class rising. So we do think that there are strong fundamentals behind the rise in these markets, and we are quite positive in these sectors in China. Looking at the dollar now, we do expect monetary policies in developed markets and in the US to continue to cap the rise of the dollar, which will be positive for emerging markets as well.
Yeah, we'll listen to see what commentary there is pushing back at all against stronger euro developments, Morgan. In terms of your strategy or your focus with investors at this point, we've talked a bit about the clean energy push. We've talked about growth versus value. Also coming through in 2020 in some strength has been a focus on entertainment in the home. And I wonder how clients are looking to ETFs to try and to capitalize on that trend.
We are seeing, since we launched in mid-December, we're seeing a tremendous interest for video games and esports, and this has been also accelerated and accentuated by the pandemic and the stay-at-home economy. We saw the dollar spent on entertainment shifting away from traditional entertainment towards video games and esports. This industry has been growing extremely fast last year and is expected expected to continue to rise this year, at reaching $184 billion. This is almost half of the people worldwide that are playing video games. So we do think these trends not to reverse after the pandemic. We do see a continuation of these trends, especially now that is widening in terms of consumer base.
I will confirm that playing video games is an addictive. You know, once you start, you just can't stop, as my wife could attest to. What are your conviction trades here as we start to reopen the economy, and how soon do you expect that to happen? Is that a summer thing? Do we wait for the fall?
Well, I think it all depends on the rollout for vaccines, which drives a lot of uncertainty in terms of how quickly the recovery will happen. At the moment, we don't see it happening before the second half of the year, at least. So all the stay-at-home themes will still be extremely relevant in the first half of the year. Once the economy reopens, then we're seeing some themes around cloud computing, but also other technologies enabling flexibility at work that will continue to succeed, especially because companies will want more flexibility going forwards and for unforeseen events, but also because they saw quite positives behind being able to have this flexibility working at home and working in the office. So we do see a continuation of these trends in the reopening economy.
Interesting stuff. Morgan, thank you very much. Yeah, interesting you say that half the global population plays video games. I can confirm that half of the presenting team of this program plays video games. And a quick straw poll of our producers says we're on a similar percentage there as well. Now, Morgan Deldon, thank you very much for joining us, Global X ETFs Director of Research. Morgan will be continuing her conversation with Matt and I on Bloomberg Radio at 9 a.m. UK time. You'll find us there on London DAB or however you listen to digital radio. Don't miss our coverage of the ECB meeting throughout the day. The policy decision is at 12:45 London time, and Christine Lagarde's press conference starts at 1:30 p.m. London time. Coming up on the programme, though, EU leaders meet today in a bid to confront the raging coronavirus pandemic amid a rising death toll and more stringent lockdowns. We have the details on the latest developments for you next. This is Bloomberg.
least on our side, the production, the quality checks, and the supply distribution capability exists for us to be able to play our part in meeting that objective. And so far, nothing we see discourages us.
That was Moderna's chairman there telling Bloomberg exclusively that he sees nothing to prevent the group from playing its role in Joe Biden's ambitious vaccine drive. Now, vaccines offer a light at the end of the tunnel, but here in Europe, that light seems to be dimming a bit. EU leaders are going to meet today to tackle the bloc's coordinated response amid vaccine delays and fears over new variants. This morning, German deaths have risen above 50,000 for the first time. Our reporter in Brussels, Maria Tadeo, is here with more on the pandemic and how Europe plans to accelerate the response. Maria?
Right, Matt, and this is coming in a video conference from European leaders today, of course, after a day in which we have seen cases jumping in Spain to a record. We've seen German deaths also now topping 50,000 people dead as a result of coronavirus, and there's a lot of chat across Europe about potential new restrictions that could be to come. We know that in the Netherlands there will be a curfew starting Friday, and the Belgians are now floating that perhaps they could now ban all non-essential travel into the country. Now, in terms of the call, as I said, a lot will be focused on the distribution, how to accelerate that. This has been a problematic week for the Pfizer vaccine, which is still the main one and the lead one when it comes to the European Union. They had issues with the delivery, they're upgrading their capabilities, but it meant that there has been a shortfall this week on those distributions. And there will be also a very clear call to the regulator to act faster, to get more vaccines approved quickly so more people can get vaccinated.
And I know, Maria, you've been keeping across the latest EU response to developments in Washington. What have you been hearing?
Yeah, and Anna, we spoke to the head of the commission, Ursula von der Leyen, yesterday alongside 3 other reporters. She was very keen to say that Biden is a friend to Europe, that she sees potential for deals to come on trade, on tech, also on the digital tax. And I also asked her, will China be a problem? This is what she had to say. Let's take a look.
What China is concerned, we as the European Union, we know exactly on what side of the table we're sitting. We are sitting on the side of the democracies next to our American friends. And indeed, China is a systemic rival.
And that was the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. It's interesting. She pointed out this investment deal was about business interests, was about protecting our companies. This was not about the politics with China, Anna.
Okay, Maria, thanks very much. Brussels reporter Maria Tadeo with the latest developments out of Brussels. Coming up, a new era begins with Joe Biden sworn in as president and pledging to repair international alliances. We'll dive into the geopolitics next. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Markets. This is the European Open. We are 30 minutes into the session right now, and we're looking at some gains across the board. Take a look at the Stocks 600 index, and you'll see it's up about 0.7% right now. If you were to run a group ranked return screen, you would see the gainers here include travel and leisure stocks right there up at the top, automakers and parts makers. So the car stocks are rising today, as well as technology, telecom, banks, and I had this yesterday. It is personal care, drugstores, and grocery stores also doing well today. Let's get the Bloomberg First Word News. For that, we go to Laura Wright in London. Laura?
Thanks, Matt. The UK has suffered its worst day of the pandemic so far. Yesterday, more than 1,800 daily deaths were announced, with the chief scientific advisor warning some hospitals now look like a war zone. More than 4.6 million people in the UK have had their first doses of the vaccine. China is sanctioning former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and other Trump administration officials. Beijing announced the move just as President Joe Biden was being inaugurated. The White House says the last-minute sanctions are unproductive, saying they're an attempt to play up America's partisan politics. The Bank of Japan is seeing a stronger rebound than expected once the economy starts to recover. It's predicting weaker growth at the end of the current fiscal year, but that means stronger growth later on. It sees the 2021 expansion at 3.9%, up 0.3%. As expected, the central bank kept policy unchanged. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Matt, Anna.
Laura, thank you. Laura Wright here in London. Joe Biden has been sworn in as the 46th President of the United States. In his inaugural speech, he pledged to reset the tone in Washington, that it was down to business, heading to the White House to sign 15 executive orders to unwind Trump administration policies from immigration to climate, as well as enacting some of his own agenda. Let's talk about where this leaves international relations then. Peter Trubowitz, Professor of International Relations and Director of the U.S. Center at the London School of Economics and Political Science, is with us. Professor Trubowitz, good to speak to you. It was very domestic. He will be very domestic focused, I'm sure, in tackling the coronavirus in the early days of his administration. But there were some messages in there for the international community talking about doing things in a more cooperative spirit. I suppose the big change might be in terms of the tone and the level of cooperation internationally.
Yes, I think, as you point out, I mean, his principal agenda going forward is going to be domestic. He's got to get the pandemic under control. He's got to get Americans vaccinated. But he will be focusing on the international side, and he made that very clear yesterday in the inaugural address, where he said that America is going to be re-engaged and it's going to work once again with its allies. And for a variety of reasons, I think he's likely to focus on America's European allies in particular. And one way to do this is to dial down tensions over trade and find common ground on climate change and the pandemic, which he did yesterday with respect to climate and the pandemic through those executive actions.
When you think of the positive contributions that President Trump made, or at least when he was listing off his successes yesterday at Andrews Air Force Base, one of those, I'm sure, is getting our NATO allies to contribute more to the defense bill. Do you think Biden, another one really is some of the Middle East peace agreements that he made. Do you think that Biden is going to hold the ground that Trump took rather than, giving it back? Is he going to work on the shoulders of some of the things that President Trump did?
Absolutely. And I think he's already made that clear, not only with respect to America's allies, but America's competitors. He's already said he's not going to immediately remove the tariffs on China. He's going to take 3 months to study the question and come up with a policy. And I think with respect to the Middle East, he will obviously try to work with the agreements that have been set. And I think with respect to America's allies and the European allies, I think the tone is going to be very, very different. Look, he wants coordination on a number of affronts with America's allies. And in particular, I think he wants a coordinated position towards China. And to get that, he's going to have to give something towards the Europeans. And I think that, while I don't think that means that he's going to completely reverse things on defense policy and the expectation that the Europeans pay more for defense, the tone is very much going to change.
Yeah, and if you look at some of the key appointments he's made, Professor, you point out Catherine Tai, US Trade Representative. What does the appointment of somebody like her tell us about whether Europe and the US can find that common ground on China policy?
Well, I think the main point of that, of her appointment, is to signal to the Chinese that Biden intends to be very tough going forward on negotiations over trade and investment. But I think more generally, it's a message to the American people that, whatever he does in the area of trade, he's going to have Americans back, that this is going to be a different approach than his predecessors. He is not going to just jump and go right back into TPP or move forward with with TTIP, with a trade agreement with the Europeans that does not pay dividends for average Americans. I think he gets that. And I think partly her appointment is meant to signal that to Americans, not only to America's adversaries or trade competitors and allies.
Yesterday we heard a lot about treating people with respect, and I think that's a message a lot of people have been waiting for a long time. On the other hand, you've got the Chinese to deal with in terms of their treatment of the Uyghurs, in terms of their treatment of pro-democracy protesters. You still need a little bit of strength there, right? Does Biden have that, you think, enough to deal with such an incredibly strong, growing economy?
Well, look, if we're talking about the inaugural address, I would step back and say the first thing is Joe Biden met, the test was, could he meet that moment? And he met it, because I think on the one hand, he offered very stirring words about unity over division for Americans, but he also offered what Harry Truman used to call plain talk about the challenges facing America and what it will take to overcome them. And I think, with respect to the specific question you asked, will the United States begin to push human rights again internationally? Yes, but I think that what Biden made clear yesterday is that he understands that dealing with human rights and dealing with democracy begins at home, and that the United States needs to take care of business at home while it calls for, while it focuses attention on what the Chinese are doing either in Xinjiang province or, at the same time in Hong Kong.
Professor, thank you very much for joining us, Professor Peter Trubowitz.
I thought it was. I just wanted to say it was a great point that the professor made. And yesterday, President Biden said, "Not lead by the example of power, but by the power of example." And I think that's what the professor is talking about there, Anna.
Great point.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Professor Trubowitz, International Relations Professor, Director of the US Centre at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Coming up on the programme, in the middle of the COVID crisis, a credit fund manages to notch up a market-beating 55% return in 2020. In this week's Money Undercover, Danny Berger's here. She's going to be speaking with Albacore Capital's David Allen. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the European market open. 42 minutes into a European equity trading session that looks similar to yesterday in terms of the gains being made across these European equity markets. US futures have been pointing to the upside through the Asian session. Let's get a Bloomberg Business Flash. Here's Laura Wright.
Thanks, Anna. Citigroup is cutting bonuses for dozens of its top executives. Sources tell Bloomberg the reductions will vary widely and some of the final decisions have not yet been made. The cuts are due to the bank being reprimanded last year by US regulators for failing to maintain proper risk management. No comment from Citigroup. Unilever is aiming for a tenfold increase in the amount it spends with suppliers owned by ethnic minorities. By 2025, it wants to spend 2 billion euros, just under 7% of its sourcing budget, with diverse suppliers. Unilever also wants to ensure that every person on its supply chain is earning at least a living wage by 2030. United Airlines wants to top its pre-pandemic profit margins by the end of 2023. It's mapping a path to recovery after last year's record loss. The carrier sees this year as a transition after the collapse in travel demand due to coronavirus. United says it's more than halfway to finding $2 billion in cost cuts. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Matt, Anna.
All right, Laura, thanks very much. Laura right there in London with your Business Flash. Now, the first wave of COVID-19 infections shook bond markets back in March. At the same time, private and public credit manager Albacore Capital saw its strategy outperform, returning 55% in the year 2020. Now it plans to close the $1 billion fund that posted that market-beating performance. Let's get over to Danny Berger for this week's Money Undercover. Danny?
Matt, thanks so much. And joining me is the CEO and CIO of that group, Albacore Capital Group, David Allen. David, first off, thanks so much for joining us. And I do want to start where Matt left off, and that's your dislocation fund, the one that posted this really big return. What has been the key to outperformance in a year that was very difficult for a lot of credit managers?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me on the show today. I'm glad to be here. Look, I think it's probably appropriate to quote maybe a president today, the 34th president, Dwight Eisenhower, who said plans are worthless, but planning is everything. And I think we went into the crisis really back in 2019, knowing and thinking that there would be some volatility. Markets are inherently unstable. And so really being well positioned going into 2020 was the key. And then obviously in March, being active bond pickers.
Is that a strategy you see that is going to continue to work this year as well?
Look, I think in terms of the pandemic and investing in a crisis, I think the crisis that we're in at this point looks like there's a light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccines rolling out. However, if you went back into 2019, no one would have predicted a global pandemic being the crisis of 2020. So I've been investing since the mid-'80s, first in equity markets, then in credit since the early 90s. Every crisis is a bit different. I've been through the Russia crisis, the Thai baht crisis, the telecom crisis, sovereign debt crisis, et cetera. So we expect, again, volatility to continue. And so that strategy may come back. I think at this point, we think we're near the end of the opportunity. But again, going forward, markets are inherently volatile.
How does that then inform your view on some of the more risky bonds that you perhaps would have looked at in March, things like cruises, retail? Are those still areas where you think there are opportunities, or is that largely gone with vaccines coming into the fore?
Right, that's a great question. Look, I think we believe that the way to make money in whether it's equity markets or bond markets is to be out of favor, contrarian investors. We saw an opportunity in March for really two types of companies. One type of company was, as you mentioned, cruises, which are terrific credits before the crisis, very good balance sheets, mostly investment grade credits. Immediately in March, you saw a lot of issuance in the equity capital markets and debt capital markets for the cruise lines. Carnival, Royal Caribbean, Viking Cruises raised over $40 billion of capital, which provided a runway for them to get through the crisis. In addition, there were some sectors like retail, where if you told me the GDP would be down like it was last year, many investors would be fearful of retail. But look no further than Amazon versus, let's say, Debenhams. I mean, both retailers, both very different outcomes. So we do see winners and losers. Again, it's about looking through individual credits and finding the winners among different sectors.
That certainly takes a lot of foresight, though, to sort of distinguish between those two ones, between the winners and the losers of just the retail space, for example. On that sort of riskier side, though, where are the areas that you'd stay away from as we head into the rest of 2021?
Sure. Look, one thing we don't like is we call binary credits or binary industries. So, for example, pharmaceutical industries that are testing a new vaccine. The other sector that's quite a large sector that's very active in credit is energy. You know, we've been running ESG screening since I ran the European credit business for the Canada Pension Plan back in 2010. So almost 11 years doing this now. We found that, you know, for us, ESG is a risk lens. One of the risky sectors we believe is energy. It doesn't score well on that basis. And the basic problem with energy is it's hard to predict oil prices. And of course, oil prices we saw last year went from $80 at the top to at one point negative. And so energy is a sector we continue to be very cautious. We don't invest in energy. The other sectors I think could be difficult. You know, people shouldn't confuse COVID with disruption. And so if you look at Debenhams, that was probably going to go out of business at some point anyway. And I think the pandemic accelerated that. So department stores, some restaurants, I think will continue to be difficult sectors.
David, a lot of these ones that we're speaking of are more in the public bond sphere, but of course you manage private credit as well. How does that mix in terms of rewards and risk look going forward to you?
Look, I think it's a pendulum of relative value. I mean, if you asked me in March of 2020, was there a private transaction that we would prefer versus buying, you know, a bond at 65 or 70 cents that we thought was worth par? It's very difficult to find something with that kind of upside and that kind of, you know, total return potential. So it really depends on the market environment. I would say from March through about June, we were very active in the public markets where the relative value was superior. But as you know, I've seen shows previously you've done about private markets where the private credit market does offer a premium for liquidity, for the underwriting fee, for the managers. And so over long periods of time, there is some value there. But again, in pockets of time, there isn't. Today, given where the public markets are, which are quite at the rich end, at the tights, we actually have pivoted the business much more to the private side. And so today, our pipeline is probably 75 to 80% on the private side, and we're actually reducing some of the positions on the public side.
Right. David, thank you so much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. David Allen, CEO and CIO of Albacore Capital Group. Anna, Matt?
Danny, thank you very much. Really interesting conversation. Doesn't it just tell you a lot about the nature of global finance, that you can have a conversation from Sao Paulo about Debenhams? Really interesting. Thanks very much, Danny, for bringing us that interview. Coming up on the program, how soon will the S&P 500 rise above 4,000? We could even talk about 5,000 if you don't feel like 4,000 is far away enough. We'll put that question to the Market Live's Laura Cooper. This is Bloomberg.
administration by making that an explicit priority to get back to dealing with climate change and emissions, to addressing some of the social consequences of this crisis. That is something that is very aligned with our agenda.
That was the Unilever CEO, Alan Jope, speaking to our colleague Anne-Marie Horden earlier on this week. Joining us now, Laura Cooper, Bloomberg Markets Live macro strategist, to digest where we are on these markets. 53 minutes into the trading session then, Laura, and we see European markets up by 0.4%, kind of continuing where we left off. Where do we see benefiting most from the blue wave? It seems that some reflation trades have been built in over recent weeks, and clearly climate trades, as we talked about with our ETF guest earlier, very much in vogue.
Well, certainly, I think certainly that the Biden presidency really does set the stage for this clean energy revolution. And although we saw 2020 as really a record year for these kind of stocks exposed to climate change, I certainly think that we're seeing a handoff to 2021 that can sustain momentum. If we look, triple-digit gains in some stocks last year, but these are still quite nascent industries. So when we look at, for example, electric vehicles, solar, these are set to directly benefit from billions in stimulus that are going to be directed under Biden's clean energy initiative. So I really think that we are going to see kind of those particular trades have legs as this green wave takes hold.
What's going to happen when the inauguration was yesterday? I think everyone is still blown away by Lady Gaga's rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner. Probably the second best I've ever heard after Jimi Hendrix. But when we kind of get out of this, when we get off cloud nine and realize Mitch McConnell's not passing a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill, no way, no how, are we going to see the market start to come back down from 4,000 then?
Well, I certainly think, given the good news that's priced into markets and the fact that really the stimulus boost is underpinning just the momentum that we are seeing in the rally. So not just kind of those reflation trades kind of continuing to grind higher, but we're also seeing tech join in now as well. So I think clearly if we do see some stumbles on the stimulus front, we are likely going to see pushback from Republicans that, yes, markets are going to have to reprice those expectations. Now, the timing of that certainly remains to be seen, but then we could also see markets shift kind of the narrative back to vaccine rollouts. If those begin to accelerate on the back of a Biden push, then that could kind of pin those growth hopes. So really at this point, it's kind of hard to see an obvious catalyst to stop the momentum in markets, but clearly stimulus hurdles is a major one ahead.
Laura, thank you very much. Laura Cooper with the latest on these markets. Matt, I thought Lady Gaga was phenomenal. I thought Amanda Gorman and her poetry, that was really, really very moving. I thought Lady Gaga actually looked just really relieved to have made it down those stairs without falling over, because that
she had a giant dress. I have to say, even though I'm obviously incredibly manly, I was in absolute tears by the time she was done with the Star-Spangled Banner, and then the Pledge of Allegiance just pushed me over the edge. But yeah, Amanda Gorman, such an inspiring young woman, such an incredible future ahead of her, and it was great to see her at the inauguration.
We are all in favour. We are all in favour of men who can cry on this programme, Matt Miller. So there's no shame in that. 8:56 here in London, 9:56 in Paris and Berlin. Matt and I will be taking our tears or not to radio. European equity markets on the front foot this morning. This is Bloomberg.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
The United States inaugurates its 46th president. Joe Biden pledges to unify and put an end to uncivil war. COVID ravages Europe. Britain and Germany suffer their deadliest days with UK hospitals like a war zone. And as lockdown grow longer and harsher, how does the economy cope? That's a question before Christine Lagarde and the ECB today. Well, good morning, everyone. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. After the festivities of the inauguration yesterday, today we try and take stock of the policies ahead and, of course, the battle that Joe Biden will have, certainly for his stimulus package in Congress. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and this is what the markets are looking at. Now, there's still quite a lot of optimism that actually we'll get a big stimulus bill out of the U.S. We had that testimony 2 days ago of Janet Yellen on how that $1.9 trillion relief package will actually be spent. And overall, the markets are not only focusing on that and optimism that as vaccines roll out, accelerate, things will get a little bit better, but global stocks are rising with the dollar slipping. Now, I'm looking at European shares rising some 0.7%. Apologies, with cyclical stocks, including automakers and banks, leading gains. Now, let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. The UK has suffered its worst day of the pandemic so far. Yesterday, more than 1,800 daily deaths were announced, with the chief scientific advisor warning some hospitals now look like a war zone. More than 4.6 million people here in the UK have had their first dose of the vaccine. Now, China is sanctioning former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and other Trump administration officials. Beijing announced the move just as President Joe Biden was being inaugurated. The White House says the last-minute sanctions are unproductive, saying they are an attempt to play up Americans' partisan politics. And Italy's Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte has won the backing for 32 billion euros of extra government spending. The two houses of Parliament approved plans to widen the country's deficit, allowing it to raise more funds to fight the pandemic. Conte is also trying to consolidate support for his now minority government. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Leanne, thank you so much. Now, Joe Biden was sworn in as the 46th president of the United States yesterday. Here's a look at the highlights.
One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The duties of the office upon which I am about to enter.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Una nación bajo Dios, indivisible, con libertad y justicia para todos. Let's get
Preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
We've learned again that democracy is precious. Democracy is fragile. And at this hour, my friends, democracy has prevailed.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound.
For there is always light if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
From the wealthy to those struggling to make it, from every human being, regardless of their choices, that this is our country in the strong name of our collective faith. Amen.
Well, joining us this morning to talk about the inauguration, but much more, of course, of policies forward, is Anthony Gardner. He's former U.S. ambassador to the EU. Ambassador Gardner, thank you so much for joining us. So this is now day 2 of President Biden and his administration. How much partisan division is there still going to be in Washington?
Well, Francine, thank you for having me on the program. There is, of course, going to be still a lot of partisan division. Remember that more than half of the Republican members of Congress voted not to certify the results of the election. And unfortunately, millions of Americans think the election still was a fraud and was unfairly taken from them. And that's not going to be an easy thing to fix. But I'll tell you this, one of the reasons that I supported President Biden from the beginning is that if anyone can bring the country together, reduce the divisions, it surely is Joe Biden. He's had a lot of experience doing it under the Obama administration and when he was in the Senate. And I thought that not only because of his professional qualifications, but his personal characteristics in being a healer, we really need Joe Biden now.
But Ambassador, how does President Biden actually, fix this division? Is it through, is it inequality that needs to be addressed? Is it, growth? Is it GDP? Like, what are the concrete policies that actually can make politics a little bit more bearable?
Well, indeed, inequality has been with us for a while, and it's gotten worse under the last 4 years. So there are a lot of things that this president is going to put on the table, and one of them is the minimum wage, which is certainly one issue, to make sure everyone has a living wage, but also change our tax system to ensure that those who can afford to pay more actually do so. The tax reform in some ways was a good thing, was overdue, but it did skew the benefits of that reform to the most wealthy. So that will need to change, but that is a long-term issue. Shorter term, we're going to need to find some areas, whether it's infrastructure spending, tailor a stimulus program, work together on renewable energy projects and make the United States a leader in renewable energy. We're going to need to find ways we can work together for sure. The fact that the Democrats now potentially have a swing vote in favor will help us achieve some of those areas. But that's not a solution, because one vote could swing the other way, and there will be partisan divisions for sure.
Ambassador Gardner, how many people you think, and it's not a number, but maybe percentage of people that don't believe this was a legitimate election? And so should the Biden administration worry about that? Is there something more immediate that they can do to just, try and make more people believe that he is the legitimate president?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm not sure there's an answer to this, but maybe there should be some kind of a commission that should be set up to look into this election and to restate what a lot of people already know, that it was not the result of fraud, but it was a free and a fair election. Remember, there were more than 60 lawsuits that alleged fraud, and 60 of them, I believe, concluded that there was no fraud. But perhaps we need something more, because indeed we can't have a country where tens of millions of citizens believe that they were defrauded. That is a very dangerous situation. And we need to look again into the role of the media, particularly of online platforms, in monetizing and promoting hate speech and propaganda. And I should just say, perhaps it's not entirely appropriate, but I want to say that you and Bloomberg and Quality Media have done an exceptional job over the past 4 years defending truth and defeating lies. And this is a line that Biden used in his inaugural address. It's incumbent on all of us to do that, because democracy is shown to be fragile.
Ambassador, when you look at some of the policies that Joe Biden has put in place, and maybe we start with the stimulus and the $1.9 trillion package that he put together, we have moderates Republicans such as Mitt Romney coming up and actually showing misgivings about it. Is there anything that makes you think that this will have to be watered down quite significantly, or at least a little bit, to again find common ground?
Look, I'm not an expert on the technicalities or the contents of that stimulus package, but it's perfectly legitimate to have concerns about some aspects of this package. That's, for example, some Americans are going to be getting money when they don't necessarily need it, that it's too much stimulus, that sets up inflationary problems for the future and so forth. All of that's perfectly legitimate. But I think we do need further stimulus now in the middle of a pandemic. If there's a time, if there ever was a time to engage in stimulus, it surely has to be now, at the time of extremely low interest rates, when we desperately need spending on infrastructure and in areas that can increase the growth rate of our economy.
Does Biden and his administration focus on domestic issues before looking at foreign policy?
Well, clearly the bandwidth is going to be taken up by the raging pandemic, about inequality, you mentioned, about domestic issues and divisions, for sure. But let's be clear, there are a lot of global issues that can't just be put away for tomorrow. And there's a long list. I mean, climate change is one of them. That's an existential threat, which unfortunately is now even closer to us than it was 4 years ago. So we're going to have to engage right away, and we will. And then there also is dealing with China and reforming the world trading system. And that's also a domestic issue, as we saw. It was very much a domestic issue under Donald Trump, and quite rightly so. And we need to engage with our allies, for sure, including the EU. That's not going away. So those are just two examples where we just can't postpone our ability as an international actor to lead. The EU, for example, has to now return as a major partner of ours, particularly on reforming the abusive trade investment practices of China. Francine, I find it bizarre that we haven't engaged with the EU because it is a superpower in terms of trade. And we are more likely to address structural imbalances with China, working with our allies, than going it alone.
All right, thank you so much, Anthony Gardner, there, the former U.S. ambassador to the EU, and thank you so much also for the kind words on behalf of members of the media. In the meantime, we're also hearing, we were just talking about actually Dr. Fauci addressing the World Health Organization, so we'll follow anything and everything he says. We know that Joe Biden and his administration will focus, certainly in the first 100 days, possibly as a priority to try and get coronavirus under control. That means vaccine distribution. That also means getting a handle of on the cold chain to make sure that we have freezing temperatures for these vaccines to get to the right people safely. Now, coming up, the skies lit up in celebration in D.C. yesterday as Joe Biden was sworn in as president. But his stimulus plan, is it giving investor fireworks? We'll talk about the COVID relief package next. This is Bloomberg.
It is critically important that the markets stay open in this time as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
There's no question that there's broad support for a second economic relief package.
I think what governors need is not just short-term stimulus, but probably something that we can play out over the next couple years.
The initial proposal put forth by the incoming Biden administration is double the size that Wall Street was really expecting.
We probably end up at the very low end in the $750 billion range if they really try to get 60 votes, and 10 of which would need to come from the Republican conference. At the high end, maybe $1.5 trillion.
Let us not pretend we are in an intensely partisan environment, and Joe Biden wants to win on his agenda, and he'll use every political trick in the book to do it.
A number of guests there on Bloomberg TV discussing the size of a stimulus package that President Joe Biden is likely to get. Now, joining us is Elga Barch, head of macro research at BlackRock Investment Institute. Always a treat to speak to Elga, especially on such an important day, the day after inauguration and ECB day. Elga, thank you for joining us. A number of concerns or a number of questions about what kind of recovery we'll see, given we're still looking at hospitals which in many Western countries look like war zones. The number of infections are going up. The number of deaths also rising with it, but we're seeing rollout of vaccines, and actually markets are supported by all the central bank action. What do you think is our biggest challenge over the next 6 months?
Biggest challenge, I think, by a long shot, is the getting control of the virus infections. There is sort of light at the horizon. And that will pave the way for an accelerated restart of the economy, because this is clearly not a regular business cycle. This is the aftermath of a natural catastrophe, but that allows activity to normalize much more quickly than you would see in a traditional business cycle.
Does the stimulus package in the U.S., $1.9 trillion, if it goes through, okay, and he does have the Biden presidency, has votes for it, what does it mean for your outlook for the U.S. economy?
So first of all, I think we need to underscore that it was essential throughout the crisis, and the crisis is still ongoing, to bridge across the disruptions in incomes and cash flows, and that a good chunk of this package is a fiscal support package more than a fiscal stimulus package. But increasingly, and I think led by the US, we're moving from fiscal support towards fiscal stimulus, which is also needed to sort of prepare for the post-COVID world and address a number of challenges or structural trends that were accelerated through the pandemic, including inequality, as we heard in the previous segment.
Are you worried that this will lead to inflation stronger than expected, and so a normalization from central banks sooner than the markets think?
I am concerned that we see higher inflation over the medium term, not so much because of the fiscal policy, but because of the change in the monetary policy frameworks. We know that the Federal Reserve intends to be more tolerant of inflation overshoots in the future, that they will worry less about the labor market running too hot than they did in the past. So that, I think, amounts to a change in the Federal Reserve's reaction function, and that together with cost pressures caused by the COVID pandemic, caused by globalization being rewired, will push inflation higher. But I don't think it will push interest rates or nominal bond yields higher. In fact, it will push real rates lower, and thus allows the economy to grow even stronger and supports risk assets.
Elga Barch, as we're doing this interview, Dr. Fauci is also addressing the World Health Organization, and just seconds ago he said that the U.S. will join, of course, this World Health Organization-backed vaccine scheme, COVAX. So he just said it 2 seconds ago, which President Trump had claimed was too China-centric. Elga, when you look at the trajectory so far, at the various speeds at which countries are also delivering vaccines, the various variants, what's your base case, and when you're expecting a lot of economies to fully reopen, or at least reopen enough to get some of that GDP lost?
So it looks, based on what we see at the moment, and it's the interaction, obviously, between the rollout of the vaccines, their effectiveness, and sort of other measures, and the prevalence of the virus in the population, that sort of will sort of drives to the normalization of lives and economic activity. It looks as if the US and the UK are ahead of continental Europe in sort of this race. And so you could sort of in the spring quarter, we could start to see some of the restrictions being sort of eased. But for the moment, I think we're looking at longer and stricter lockdowns than what we were expecting late last year.
Elga Bartsch, can the U.S. actually be the driving force in terms of economic prosperity? Is it, the U.S. that will help also Europe get better into 2021, 2022?
The US is clearly an important component, but I think we should not lose sight of the fact that it's actually China that was the only economy that grew last year and will continue to grow materially this year. So that's actually the second largest economy, is at the moment very much an engine of global growth and in particular of regional growth in Asia, over in Asia, and that's one reason why we like to seek equity exposure in that region.
Thank you so much. Elga Bartsch there from BlackRock Investment Institute stays with us. Now, coming up, a new era. Joe Biden takes office with a plea for unity and promising a dramatic shift in global relations. Much more, of course, on the top story throughout the program. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, Anthony Fauci, the U.S. government's top infectious disease expert, has been speaking at the WHO Executive Board meeting. He says the U.S. will join COVAX, that's a global vaccine program. He also told the meeting that the U.S. will fulfill its financial obligations to the World Health Organization and also that it will work constructively to reform the organization. Now, onto the markets. There is quite a lot going on, certainly in equities. Now, we don't have any huge moves, but the focus is firmly on stimulus package, the fact that they still think that it will go through. And then we did see a bit of movement on pound, steadily rising, actually. This means that it's the highest since 2018, currently cable 137.45. Now, it does add, or it's been adding gains, spurred by slightly stronger than expected inflation data. That was on Wednesday. We have plenty more on Bloomberg.
Another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
I was actually poor.
No foreplay?
Eat your bag of Lay's with a smile on your face.
If all the diseases have been taken, I'll take a tax.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. President Joe Biden has used his inaugural address to call on America to end its uncivil war. He said unity would be key to tackling the challenge of the pandemic and rescuing the U.S. economy. The inauguration was a stripped-back event under heavy security, but it did retain some of the usual pomp, including Lady Gaga singing the national anthem. Now, the Bank of Japan is seeing a stronger rebound than expected once the economy starts to recover. It is predicting weaker growth at the end of the current fiscal year, but that means stronger growth later on. It sees a 2021 expansion at 3.9%, up 0.3%. As expected, the central bank kept policy unchanged. And Indonesian investigators are now looking into the automatic throttle of the Boeing jet that crashed into the sea on January the 9th. There are concerns that a malfunction could have led to the crew losing control. Bloomberg sources say the throttle was producing more thrust in one of the two engines shortly before the plane did crash. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Leanne, thanks so much. Now, ECB policymakers are again facing an economy gripped by the virus as they hold their first meeting of the year today. President Christine Lagarde says last week the central bank's economic growth projection are still, quote, very clearly plausible. Her upbeat tone is increasingly threatened, though, by stricter lockdowns and a slow vaccine rollout across the region. Well, still with us, Elga Bartsch from BlackRock Investment Institute. Elga, thank you so much for staying with us. When you look at some of the challenges that the ECB has, first of all, how likely is it that they can actually stick on this path also for growth forecasts?
I do think that we're looking at a situation where the European economy is double dipping and where we will print a negative GDP growth rate also in the first quarter, not just in the fourth quarter. So the economic restart that we all are hoping for is likely to be delayed. And that could mean that the ECB indeed faces the same thing as the Bank of Japan, that it's stronger growth, but it's later. And as a result, could sort of renew the debate and would clearly, I think, nip in the bud all discussions of a even implicit tapering and early reduction of the pace of bond purchases. And that is what I would expect to hear this afternoon.
Yeah. Do they need to address the level of the euro?
Well, I think they need to keep an eye on it, which they do. I don't think they need to really address it because it seems to have come off the boil in recent weeks. So this is not anymore a bigger concern than it was back in December. But what markets, I think, are hoping to understand is what the clause that was inserted in the statement that references the preservation of easy financing conditions mean. Does that mean that the ECB is now implicitly targeting financing conditions in the euro area? And would that also pave the way potentially to doing less if financing conditions were easy enough already? And I think on the back of the accounts of the meeting, which show that there was a lively debate around this topic, I think there will be a number of questions along those lines at the press conference.
Elga, how do you see them viewing this? And actually, at the moment, is it 100% convincing to say that the ECB is actually targeting yield curve control, even if they don't call it that?
To be honest, I mean, in Europe, yield curve control is a lot more complex than it would be elsewhere because we are looking at a multinational central bank. So, which I think is why it's about the financing conditions, because that would also include some form of spread control. So it's an assessment of sort of how much support the economy gets from the monetary side. But we also, I think, need to be clear that in the current environment where the economy is gripped by a virus, monetary policy is only providing an assist to the public health measures that are taken, the vaccine rollout, and the fiscal policy support that helps to bridge incomes, cash flows across the disruptions caused by the virus.
Olga, I was looking at your weekly commentary that you've done with colleagues, and it's fantastic. Two things really actually caught my eye. You talk about this ever-transforming bipolar U.S.-China world, and then you also mentioned some of the turbocharged transformations that we talk about, but maybe investors don't fully understand what it means. How will our economies and how will our world look differently post-pandemic?
I think it will look quite a bit different, especially when it comes to the sort of structural composition of the economy, its structural features, even once activity is back to where it was before the pandemic, once it's sort of back to the pre-pandemic growth path, which is something that we expect to happen relatively quickly and much more so than it did after the global financial crisis, when we had a decade of declining trend growth. So this is a very important difference. But another important difference is that you see an enormous amount of change, of accelerated structural and secular changes below the hood of the macroeconomic activity. So there's sectors, it's digitalization, it's social features such as inequality, it's the focus on sustainability and the resilience of business models. And one important aspect of that is the rewiring of globalization on the back of the geopolitical situation and the rivalry between the US and China.
How do you see China overall? I mean, they had some pretty incredible growth figures. When's the point where actually China starts spending a lot more?
So, I mean, China clearly had a more effective and more radical control of the virus. And as a result, sort of was able to restart activity more quickly in the course of last year, and hence was the only major economy that actually expanded last year and is already returning not just to the pre-COVID activity level, but also to converge back to the pre-COVID growth trend. So that's very encouraging. And as a result, I think in China you have a somewhat different discussion around policy stimulus, whether it's monetary or fiscal. It's more about sort of a gradual normalization rather than adding additional stimulus, which is where Europe is at the margin, where the US is at in the wake of the new administration being sworn in.
Elga Bartsch, thank you so much for joining us, Head of Macro Research there at BlackRock Investment Institute. Now, don't miss, of course, our coverage of the ECB meeting throughout the day. The policy decision comes at 12:45 p.m. UK time. Christine Lagarde's press conference then starts at 1:30 p.m. UK time. Now, coming up, a new daily record for global virus fatalities, but 54 million people across the world have now been vaccinated. We'll bring you the very latest. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's talk about the vaccine race now. And Bloomberg spoke to Moderna co-founder and chair Noubar Afeyan, who says everyone across the vaccine supply chain is rapidly learning to overcome challenges.
We believe that, at least on our side, the production, the quality checks, and the supply distribution capability exists for us to be able to play our part in meeting that objective. And so far, nothing we see discourages us from continuing to work hard to do that. But I think that the plans exist to do that, and the production systems are functioning according to our plans.
So the urgency has never been greater given the soaring cases and the fact that the vaccine is out there. It is available. It's just a matter of getting it. Give us a picture of your production rate. Will Moderna be able to hit its own targets, 100 million doses this quarter, 100 million next quarter?
Well, look, we can do only as much as we're able to do, in the sense that we haven't done this and nobody else has done this before. So in other words, nobody has gone from zero output of this particular type of product to what we hope by the end of this year will be 1 billion doses we will have produced. So it's important for us to understand that because that has not been done doesn't mean it can't be done. But because it hasn't been done, we can't just say, oh yeah, you know, we've done this 100 times before. We are in uncharted territory as a globe. We're in uncharted territory medically, and we're in uncharted territory in terms of production and supply. And so what we can do is to plan, have backups, have various measures put in place to be able to detect any faults very early on and compensate for them. All of those systems are in place. They're functioning. But until we have done that, we won't be able to point to having already done it as a reason to believe, because it's being done for the first time. We think that 100 million doses as a objective in the coming couple of months, and then another 100 million by the end of the second quarter as our commitment goal with the U.S. is something that we feel we're on track to meet. Lots of variables can get in the way.
Now, the vaccine shortages in New York and elsewhere are scary. You've got people out there who've gotten a first dose who don't know if they'll get a second dose, and certainly folks who haven't gotten any vaccine yet at all. I know that the New York issue specifically don't have anything to do with Moderna. It's actually your distributor that had an issue with the ice packs. That said, how many doses do you know may have gone unused in the United States because of temperature issues?
You know, I don't have that information, and that's not information that I think is going to be ready to come by, because we're dealing with hundreds and thousands of outlets and a distribution infrastructure that is being run by McKesson and is being coordinated by the group that has been working, our counterparts under General Perna. So I think what's really more important is that we are all learning at a very rapid pace. The various states are learning themselves how they can get better organized, better forecast. There are issues with storage, as you said. Unfortunately, there's 2 different vaccines out that have quite different handling and storage requirements. And so we're all going to have to kind of be ready to recognize that there will be things that we're doing that don't work perfectly well. And look, the frustration we all feel is a different kind of frustration than the fear that we all felt that we were completely vulnerable to the virus and there's nothing we could do about it. Now there's something we can do about it, and we have to get organized and make sure enough time passes and enough experiences is accumulated.
Well, that is the Moderna co-founder and chair, Noubar Afeyan. Now let's stay on the subject, of course, and bring you up to date with the latest on the virus. A new daily record has been set for global fatalities. Now, Germany says it's now lost more than 50,000 people, and the UK also saw its deadliest day yet, with over 1,100 1,800 reported deaths yesterday. Now, across the world, more than 54 million people have now received the vaccine, though the rollout speed remains a bit patchy. So let's hear from our reporters, Maria Tadeo in Brussels and Laura Wright here in London. Maria, let's kick off with you. European leaders meeting today to discuss the virus. Could there actually be more lockdowns and restrictions coming?
Well, Francine, there could be more restrictions and potentially more national measures taken, but a lot of this call would focus on the distribution. The European countries now saying this needs to be accelerated in order to speed up the vaccinations. And this is happening, Francine, as you know, in a week that has been problematic for Pfizer, which is still the main and the leading vaccine for the Europeans. They had a number of issues when it comes to their production, their upgrade and their capabilities, which is good over the long term, but it's bad over the short term. And we have seen a shortfall in deliveries this week. And then also, Francine, just happening this morning, we have a working paper that the Germans will put forward potentially today to say that if there was a risk of mutations from the UK entering the European Union, the EU should consider as a whole to restrict travel passengers entering the EU. So that would be a similar travel ban to that of the US entering the European Union. That could have big diplomatic consequences, of course, but it's an idea that is being pushed around today in Brussels. It's not an official document, but we do have indications that the Germans do believe that it's an option that should be considered, especially if that risk of virus mutation does go in crescendo and there is a risk that it could be transmitted into the European Union.
Thank you. And Laura, bring us up to date exactly with what's going on in the UK. I mean, we had those number of horrific deaths, over 1,800 in one day in the UK.
That's right, Francine. Well, yesterday, the UK reported over 1,800 coronavirus deaths, the most in a 24-hour period since the pandemic began. That brings the total number of UK fatalities to over 92,000. At yesterday's daily press briefing, Sir Patrick Vallance, Boris Johnson's chief scientific advisor, said that UK hospital wards resemble a war zone. Data suggests that 1 in 36 people in the capital are currently infected. On the other hand, the UK vaccination deployment program has been expedited. Over 4.6 million people have received their first jab of a vaccine. On January 19th alone, over 340,000 people were inoculated. The target is for 15 million people to receive their first dose of a vaccine by February 15th so that lockdown measures can be eased. That's why the UK government has decided to space out the time between the first and the second jab so that more people can be vaccinated on aggregate. It's worth saying that we are now at group 4 in the government's vaccination priority list, those who are aged 70 or over.
Thank you so much, both Maria Tadeo there in Brussels and Laura Wright right here in London, looking at the vaccination process and some of the numbers, of course, horrific numbers. And our family, or our thoughts go with the families, of course, of those in hospital first and foremost. Now, coming up, a bumper quarter for America's biggest banks. Record trading revenue helped Wall Street to better than most other industries. We'll bring you the details next, and this is Bloomberg.
Climate change is the defining issue of our time, so we've redefined how we cover it. With clear data and rigorous journalism, we rise to the scale of the challenge to reveal the breadth of possibility. We look at stories from every angle to provoke debate, spotlight solutions, and make sense of the greatest crisis of our generation. Bloomberg Green, solutions for a changing climate.
It is critically important that the markets stay open in this time as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
I think we're going to see a much stronger coordinated federal effort to roll out some of these critical public health efforts that have really fallen to our state and local health officials.
The number one thing that they should be doing is getting more vaccine into the commercial channel and forgetting about all this central planning.
We do see, obviously, vaccines being an important dynamic to kind of get us out of the hole we're in.
All routes to prosperity for our country float through curing the virus.
With a very clear federal partnership using their logistic ability, their manufacturing ability to make sure we don't run out of vials and syringes, their communication strategy to echo and re-echo a public health message, all of that's been missing.
Those were some of the guests that we spoke to about President Biden's plan to tackle the pandemic. Now, earlier this hour, Dr. Fauci also confirmed that America's commitment to the World Health Organization was strong. Now, let's get to one of our other top stories. And the biggest Wall Street banks wrapped up their earnings this week after Morgan Stanley reported yesterday. Though trading revenue propelled the bumper quarter, banking stocks have fallen since the lenders began reporting. And here are the key takeaways with Bloomberg's Danny Berger. Hi, Danny.
Hi, Francine. Well, one of the big takeaways is really what you've mentioned, just how huge last quarter and really the entirety of last year has been when it comes to trading on Wall Street. This isn't necessarily surprising. A lot of the volatility, more people participating in equity markets, of course, leads to that. But what is new over the last earnings season, in a lot of these executive calls, they expressed some skepticism whether it could continue on. Both Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs saying in their earnings call that it's unlikely that this environment can be repeated in 2021. Now, in terms of some of the other top takeaways, we've seen some of the banks release more of those loan loss reserves, rather. A lot of them do seem to come from some of the more periphery businesses, but in the case of banks like Bank of America, it did come from the consumer business. So that's some confidence in the health of consumer and households in balance sheets. And we also saw that reflected in credit card and debit data, that they're spending more, and delinquencies for the most part have been held off. Now, finally, and I think this is really just the overarching theme of what we learned last year about these banks, is that the gap between the largest banks and the smaller one, and indeed likely even here in Europe and what we'll see in the earnings to come, is that the big banks are just getting bigger. JP Morgan added nearly $700 billion in assets. That amount alone would make it the sixth or seventh biggest bank in the U.S. So it's really just this wide gulf opening up between these Wall Street behemoths and all the other lenders.
Well, Danny, what have we heard actually in the guidance of, going forward?
So the economic outlook, I think, from these banks is one that is really dependent on what comes out in terms of stimulus. And of course, it's a very crucial time with Joe Biden just being sworn in as the next president. They really described an environment where the bridge for consumers so far has been good enough, but that bridge needs to be lengthened. There needs to be more runway for consumers to continue to be healthy and not feel the pain of the economic crisis that's been caused by this pandemic. So that's part of the reason we've seen a lot of these stocks not perform as well as some had hoped. That, along with the idea that the trading bonanza, as I said, is unlikely to continue this year.
Thank you so much. Our Danny Berger there with the very latest, of course, on these Wall Street banks and earnings. Now, don't miss our coverage of the European Central Bank meeting throughout the day. The policy decision, of course, comes at 12:40 p.m. UK time, and then Christine Lagarde's press conference starts 45 minutes after that at 1:30 p.m. UK time. Now, we'll have plenty more on the ECB. We look at some of the things that Joe Biden will be putting in place. We have a great, fantastic article on the Bloomberg terminal saying that after Joe Biden is seeking to wind wipe away Donald Trump's fingerprints from U.S. policy, but his predecessor left a lasting partisan division that actually means that it will be tough for Joe Biden to get some of his policies, including, of course, the $1.9 trillion plan through Congress. So we'll have plenty more on policy and, of course, currencies. Tom Keene joins me out of New York shortly. We'll get all about, well, first of all, Biden's policies, ECB. The other thing I'm watching out for is pound, always higher on inflation forecasts. This is Bloomberg. Another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
the
office of President of the United States
office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States. So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
The United States inaugurates its 46th president. Joe Biden pledges to unify and put an end to an uncivil war. COVID ravages Europe. Britain and Germany suffer their deadliest days with UK hospitals like a war zone. And as lockdowns grow longer and harsher, how does the economy cope? That's a question before Christine Lagarde and the ECB today. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacroix here in London. Tom Keene in New York. Tom, after the festivities of the inauguration, it's really trying to get to work. And what surprised me amongst, and I know we'll talk about it, the beautiful fireworks and kind of what America does best, which is show the world its power, is really policies that Joe Biden will put in place. And the fact that some moderate Republicans came out against the $1.9 trillion package is not insignificant.
Well, it's not insignificant, but not a surprise. I would say, Francine, that what we're doing here, particularly on the morning after, is getting used to a new workflow. It's easy to say that President Trump was unconventional and we get back to something new and maybe familiar as well. What I know is I thought I was the only one up at 5 a.m. and maybe we dragged Schenker out of bed and all that. It looks like President Biden is working at 5 a.m.
Yeah, or certainly his team is putting out news. Breaking news on President Joe Biden's national strategy to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. We also heard from Anthony Fauci, I think just 20 minutes ago, speaking at the World Health Organization. So for more insight, let's get to Marty Schenker, as Tom was saying, Bloomberg News editor-at-large. Marty, it's 5 a.m. and it's very clear that the Biden administration wants to get to work. What are they going to do to combat the pandemic?
Well, one of the things they're going to do that's pretty significant is invoke the Defense Production Act. For those who are not familiar, that gives the executive branch authority to target companies around the country to force them to produce the materials they need for testing and vaccine supplies and other things that, frankly, the previous administration was reluctant to do. So he announced this morning at 5 a.m. that he's going to invoke the Defense Production Act and also, not surprisingly, impose a mask-wearing mandate on all federal property and jurisdictions.
Marty, how difficult, and we see it here in Europe, even with strict measures, it's difficult to know exactly how this will, pan out, if people will follow. How important is it that actually he gets the stimulus package through, whilst doing these extra measures to contain the actual virus?
Well, there are two separate tracks. There's a certain amount of things he can do by executive order, like the mask-wearing mandate today, but he's going to have to get Republican cooperation on the stimulus proposal, the $1.9 trillion. And, Joe Biden has stressed unity yesterday, reaching across the aisle. That will be a real test of his ability to negotiate with the Republicans.
Marty, good morning. I noticed that you stayed up to see Springsteen, Land of Hope and Dreams. I was taking the surveillance news myself. Marty, what I find striking, and folks, when you see the documents that we get embargoed on the 5 a.m. Release, it's about staffing. Trump was the detritus of Ronald Reagan, the idea of less government, less staff. This looks like hitting the ground, maybe akin to the Obama administration, a fully staffed administration. I mean, staffing here seems to be a huge distinction.
Yeah, and, if you recall back 4 years ago, there weren't very many people around Donald Trump in the opening days. And so it was really difficult to know what he was going to do. Joe Biden has indeed hit the ground running with a complete staff and a set of policies that he's imposing in the first few days, which is in stark contrast to Donald Trump. I mean, he did put out our famous Muslim ban in the first few days of his administration, but nothing of this magnitude.
In the afternoon, we saw 4 presidents at the tomb of the unknown soldier. What was the signal sent by that? I mean, the president, President Trump, rather, the former president, I think struggled there with General Mattis and others over 4 years or so, and yet here yesterday seemed to be such a traditional moment.
It was a traditional moment, and again, it just echoed what he said in his inaugural address, is that to bring together the country for one purpose, and that is to move forward. And I think bringing in those former U.S. presidents was meant to signal that there is the possibility of unity of purpose in this country.
Marty, how does he unify it? How does he reach out? Does he, first of all, the new president need to reach out to the Trump base, or does he just stay the course and focus on policies?
Well, Jen Psaki, the new press secretary, was asked that very question at her first briefing yesterday, and she said, look, Joe Biden, throughout his whole history, has shown that's the way he works. He reaches across the aisle to seek compromise. So it won't be anything specific, but it'll be his personality injecting itself into every policy he pursues. He will be reaching out, and it'll be up to the Republicans to see if they want to negotiate with this president. On the confirmation side, his D&I director went through the GOP, went through the Senate 85, I believe, to 10. So that was a pretty significant bipartisan approval.
Marty, when you look at what we heard from several GOP senators like Mitt Romney, also the Wyoming Republican Liz Cheney, who had doubts about this $1.9 trillion package, is that to be expected, or could it actually put a spanner in the works? No,
as Tom said, it is to be expected. Look, the Republicans have to get used to working with a Democratic majority in both houses of Congress. So they're going to basically not just embrace everything that Joe Biden proposes on its face. They will mention some concerns, but the real question is whether or not they're going to be able to work together to come up with some compromise, which Joe Biden says he really wants. He wants Republicans to get on board on a stimulus package.
I want to get through the honeymoon, Marty, which we always do in the news business as quick as we can. And I want to go to me, the key player in all of this, in the chess game, the gambit that President Biden has, and that is a gentleman from West Virginia. What is the power of Joe Manchin as a senator? Boy, he seems to be awfully important.
He is important. He is a quote-unquote moderate Democrat. He has voted with Republicans a number of times, but he wants to stay in the Democratic side in the caucus. And since he is a moderate and there's a 50-50 split in the Senate, what he thinks is going to be supremely important, because he's going to bring moderates with him.
Is he going to get a road like Senator Byrd? I mean, you and I years ago were covering roads to nowhere. Francine, this is a joke, and I know in Japan they've picked it up as well, but are we going to have a Manchin bridge to nowhere?
We may get a Manchin mansion. But look, Joe Manchin has more than often stayed with the Democrats, and he's a constructive force in the Senate. So I think he is going to be a critical person in getting Joe Biden's agenda through.
I look at this, Marty, and I thought our coverage yesterday really was well done, and it went so much smoother than I expected. I just kept waiting for them to get something wrong in the Capitol, the inauguration planners.
I personally felt when the President and his First Lady were walking to the White House, I just had to hold my breath a little bit when he came running off to greet some of the people on the sidelines. But it did come off without a hitch, which was pretty extraordinary.
Cold but good weather as well. Martin Schenker, thank you so much, our editor-at-large here this morning. And now in New York City with our First Word News. Good morning.
All right, Tom, thank you. Avril Haines will be the first woman to oversee American spies. She became the first member of President Biden's cabinet to win Senate approval. The 84-10 vote for confirmation came hours after the president was sworn in. As Director of National Intelligence, Haines would oversee 18 intelligence agencies. Switching to the UK, it has suffered its worst day yet in the pandemic. More than 1,800 deaths recorded in a 24-hour period. And Prime Minister Boris Johnson's science advisor warning that some hospitals look like war zones. Almost 40,000 coronavirus patients are being treated in British hospitals. And the Bank of Japan is leaving its main policy unchanged. The central bank forecasts that the economy will regain more lost growth than previously thought once the current state of emergency is over. BOJ policymakers kept its interest rate and asset buying program intact. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Karina Mitchell. This is Bloomberg.
Karina, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. Let's do a data check here on a day of the ECB. We're focused on Washington. Let us be focused on Frankfurt for a good part of these hours of surveillance today. Futures up 6, Dow futures up 19. It is a global equity lift. The numbers are extraordinary. I won't bore you with them now, but you see it with a VIX, 21.44 on the VIX. Francine, I know yields contained. We really haven't had a surge in yields over the last number of days. Francine, look at Bitcoin. I shouldn't have bought it at the top.
Okay, you're looking at Bitcoin. I'm looking at Euro Sterling. The roles, Tom, have reversed. So I'm looking at global stocks. Look, they're climbing to an all-time high. Optimism that the fiscal spending will revive economic growth. But then I look at, I'm not only looking at pound, which, by the way, Tom, if you look at, dollar pound or dollar sterling, it's actually rising a third day to the highest since May 2018. And this is also on slightly stronger than expected inflation data that we had this week. No, I'm looking at Euro Sterling. And the concern there is actually that we'll probably have many questions for Christine Lagarde on euro level. So look out for that. And then I just put in crude oil there for good measure because I knew you'd look at Bitcoin, Tom.
Yeah, you know I'd look at Bitcoin, 32,660, right on the 200-day moving average, I believe. Coming up in the next hour, an important conversation, really timely. Mohammed Yunus will join us in Gallup on their polling of the state of America one day after an inauguration. Please stay with us through the morning this day of European Central Bank meetings and press conference. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
Continues to be, recovering well. And with the opening up that was decided at the last 5-year plan, that is a golden opportunity for many international banks.
So we'll look to double our footprint across IB and also wealth management and asset management in the 3 to 5 year time frame.
Growth outlook structurally is very strong. But it does need to consolidate and allow time to help the share price appreciation to move more in sync with the growth.
So China can avoid further decoupling if they stop these inappropriate actions.
But at the moment, we really want to see the dust settle first on international relationships, on China's role in the global economy.
I don't see a likelihood of a big change in the policy with the change of administrations.
That is Angela Merkel, the Chancellor, of course, of Germany, briefing the press on the COVID response. They hit a pretty grim milestone. Germany virus deaths surpassing 50,000 since the pandemic started. Angela Merkel there saying that there are dangerous virus mutations that are not yet dominant in Germany. Unfortunately, some of the virus mutations, certainly the UK mutation, was very dominant here in London. And she's also warning everyone that, look, winter will be very, very tough and test our nerves. I think a number of people are already understanding that. With Nerves of Steel, we're now joined by Eric Nielsen, his UniCredit Group chief economist. Eric, we want to talk, of course, about, first of all, the lockdowns. We're just watching Angela Merkel there brief the press. Here in London yesterday, we had the highest number of daily deaths since the pandemic started. If you're the ECB, if you're an economist now, do you need to change your forecasts? Because we're vaccinating, I guess, in certain countries as much as we can, but also it's completely out of control in certain parts of Europe.
Yeah, I think it's very tricky. And from UniCredit side of you, we are lucky. We had a structure of a tough lockdown here in the winter, so it's probably a little bit worse than we thought, but we came out sort of statistically out of last year a little bit better than we thought, so on average it may be okay. But here's the point. the uncertainties are huge, both with the spreading and the rollout of the vaccination, and then how people react to it. So I think you asked Christine Lagarde, I mean, there's not much more they can do or should do right now. It's over to the fiscal, and I hope she would say so. You talked about the US before. They are certainly not holding back, and good for them. Europe should do the same.
How much, or who can afford actually to have a lot more stimulus in Europe?
They can all afford it. This is here's the wonderful thing, right? After the great financial crisis, the Southern Europeans want to spend money, and the Germans and the Commission said, no, austerity is the name of the game. This time around, it's exactly the opposite. The Germans say they do it themselves and they spend it. The Commission say we have put all the fiscal rules aside. The ECB say we are buying the whole thing. And you still have people like the Spanish Prime Minister saying, well, maybe we can't afford it. Of course you can afford it. You borrow money at zero, de facto. And if you don't do it now, when will you do it?
Eric Nielsen, Tom Keene in New York. Good morning to you, sir. We have been focused on Washington and changing of the guard. Right now, I'd like to focus on this ECB meeting today. I think so many are unaware of the transatlantic gap. If you look at the 5-year out and then 5-year out from there, inflation expectations, it has never been wider since 2005, before the crisis, between inflation expectations U.S. and inflation expectations Europe. What does that mean for Madame Lagarde? How does that limit her choice set today, this huge gap in inflation expectations?
It's a very good question, Tom. But I think what we have now is an exceptional period where the central bank have decided, correctly in my opinion, to play second fiddle to the fiscal authorities. So you don't really have to worry about inflation. There's nothing you do today that's going to impact inflation 7, 8, 10 years out. That's probably more driven by some big structural factors. And the biggest risk we have today is that with this pandemic is going to kill off companies and activity, and thereby that shouldn't be killed off. And therefore we get a lower potential growth rate, we get a faster closing of the output gap, and thereby the inflation.
Well,
so the best is to stimulate now, right?
Eric, that's fine, but it has bounced up against the austerity and the historical austerity of all of Europe. Are we free of austerity where fiscal can act, or is that a blanket over any hopes 24 months forward?
We are close to being free of it, to be honest. The only restraints there is in this area, in my opinion, is interestingly, mostly in Southern Europe, where people are still worried too much about the public debt. Go down Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin, and to the finance ministry, that is, and there is a complete new, open-minded, analytical approach, and the right way, I think. I mean, I'm not endorsing every detail of everything, but Europe is not held back by austerity today like we were almost 10 years ago or 8 years ago.
Eric, how does the ECB actually, talk around euro?
Oh, I wish they didn't, to be honest. I mean, I don't know why Lagarde spoke about this before. Look, on any measure that I'm aware of, the euro in trade-weighted terms or against the dollar is not overvalued. It's actually still slightly undervalued, but give or take, whatever. But it is not a crazy level. It's not, we haven't had massive moves. And the central bank should not be playing after the exchange market. All it does is to get a lot of volatility into the system. Sit back and relax and see how it plays. And of course, it's part of the overall monetary conditions that they do look at. And in a sense, according to Philip Lane, have committed to prevent from tightening. And that's the right policy, since the exchange rate is not the big story, in my opinion.
What about yield curve control? Are they de facto doing yield curve control?
Yeah.
And does it actually matter?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Francine. I mean, so they would never admit that, and for good reasons. But what they did, put in place, I think it was back in March, right? They stated, and I think Philip Lane wrote it very, very clearly, he said, our objective is to prevent a tightening of monetary conditions as a result of the fiscal expansion. That's yield curve control, and this is very, very important, going further than Draghi ever did, saying this applies to all constituencies of the Eurozone. That means not only yield curve control for the bonds, but for the BTPs, thereby limiting the spreads between the sovereigns. This is the right policies. Of course, the BTP has widened, but that lately, or now tiny bit again, but that's because of domestic political uncertainties in Italy, not because of anything else.
Eric, thank you so much. Eric Nielsen there of UniCredit stays with us. Now, coming up in the next hour, Ken Rogoff, a Harvard professor and former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. We'll talk inauguration, we'll talk policy, and we'll also talk a bit about foreign relations. That's at 6:30 a.m. in New York, that's 11:30 a.m. in London, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Are you worried that people won't take the vaccine?
We remain concerned about vaccine hesitancy.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market, it's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
I'm David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
Give you a sense of the real-time action, the 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Karina Mitchell with a Bloomberg Business Flash. United Airlines is mapping out a recovery plan from last year's record loss. The goal is to top pre-pandemic profit margins in 2023. United says this year will serve as a transition after the collapse in travel demand due to the virus. United says it's more than halfway to finding $2 billion in cost cuts. Meanwhile, Alcoa is warning that higher costs may weigh on its earnings this quarter. That's holding down optimism from better-than-expected results at the end of 2020. Alcoa is forecasting rising costs in its alumina business and lower selling prices of bauxite. And Twitter has blocked out another big name in Washington. This time, it's China's embassy to the U.S. Twitter's unhappy over a post that defended Chinese government policies on the Uyghur minority. Critics say China is engaged in forced sterilization of Uyghur women. China says it is puzzled by Twitter's action. And that is the Bloomberg Business Flash. Francine.
Thank you so much, Karina. Now, the focus firmly on the data pointing to what we'll hear from the ECB. This not expected much in terms of actual change in policy, but what we are hoping to find out more is how Christine Lagarde sees the progress ahead. So let's get the data if we can, so we give you an idea of exactly what's going on. And then a pound rising actually to the highest level against the dollar in over 2 years. I'm also looking at euro sterling 0.8846, and you can see a bit of a lift to European stocks, gaining some 0.4%.
Our constructive equity tone, Francine, in the United States as well. Futures up 6, Dow futures up 22. The VIX I'm watching very closely. It seems a little bit of an adjustment off the inauguration with a lower number, less of an angst, less of a fear there, 21.49 on the VIX. We don't get correlation to higher yields. This will be interesting with Lagarde today for her yield discussion as well as her Bitcoin discussion. She has been a critic. Down $2,600, $32,200 on Bitcoin. The laureate Stiglitz this afternoon on Bloomberg. Good morning.
For a typical clothes wash, up to 700,000 fibres can come off our clothes.
Permet de collecter environ 3 à 5 tonnes de déchets de PET chaque mois. Donc, une partie est utilisée pour faire des bateaux, une autre partie pour faire d'autres poubelles et d'autres parties, bouteilles, sont plutôt stockées que nous fournissons à certains partenaires.
Valuations, particularly, sort of the technology landscape, have gotten to some pretty extraordinary levels. So I think it's not a surprise. I don't think it's any indication of the beginning of the end, but I do think markets don't like uncertainty.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
There's no question that there's broad support for a second
economic relief package.
I think what governors need is not just short-term stimulus, but probably something that we can plan over the next couple years.
The initial proposal put forth by the incoming Biden administration is double the size that Wall Street was really expecting.
We probably end up at the very low end in the $750 billion range if they really try to get 60 votes, and 10 of which would need to come from the Republican conference. At the high end, maybe $1.5 trillion.
Let us not pretend we're in an intensely partisan environment, and Joe Biden wants to win on his agenda, and he'll use every political trick in the book to do it.
Yesterday was wonderful, not only the Majesty for America, but also the conversations that our team put together. Francine and I, John Farrow, Lisa Bramwitz and all, we were just blown away by some of these conversations and perspective, a window in there to some patient people waiting to voice their interest in America. We get the interest of Eric Nielsen of UniCredit. That is a good thing. He is an optimist and sees a renewed America, no doubt. What is the price of stimulus, Eric Nielsen?
There is very little price when you have a central bank that buys the debt and keeps interest rates low, and the cost of not doing it is huge. Yes, I'm an optimist. I have usually been more optimistic on Europe. Right today, I'm very optimistic about the U.S., particularly because of the prospect of more fiscal.
Can you suggest that we will see a greater productivity? And I look at it almost with changed immigration policies, where maybe there's a tone, Eric Nielsen, where we get a more sprightly nominal GDP because of a changed immigration policy. Is that feasible?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and in many ways, what you do now is that you're spending money, you're putting money in hands, and at least the 1.9 trillion package is about putting money in the hands of people who have no money today, no savings ratio, so that you go and spend. So that is just a nominal process, but it's the right thing at the time, because what you want to do is to avoid the collapse of otherwise good companies and suppliers. And then along the way, you have to talk about the investment that gets you the productivity growth, of course.
Eric, how long will it take for the U.S. economy? So let's say that the Biden administration gets a handle on the pandemic, maybe even quicker than some of the forecast, and the 1.9 trillion gets put out on the markets. How long does it take for the U.S. not to grow in GDP, but actually to recover the ground lost because of the pandemic?
Super question. I mean, on our present forecast, which is a lower than consensus, we have them reach the pre-pandemic level in early 2022, but that's before we have put this 1.9 trillion in. If we assume that it gets, say, 1.25 trillion through or thereabout, and you broadly keep the structure as it is, I think we're talking about end of this year. It's massive. I mean, here in Europe, we had a fantastic conversation with Commissioner Gentiloni at a conference yesterday, and we were awing at the fact that the U.S. is discussing 9% of GDP in additional fiscal expansion, while we're messing around with 1 or 2% here in Europe. We're just not doing enough in Europe, and I think Biden is right to hit it pedal to the metal.
Why are we not doing enough in Europe, Eric? Is it political constraints? Is it fear of austerity, or simple fear of actually squandering the money?
Yeah, it's a good question. I really don't know. I mean, to be honest, I mean, there are two sides, because there is the European package, which is very big on our estimate, adding maybe 4% to GDP this year already, Generation EU. But we're talking about national stuff. And I think, if I had to guess, but I don't know why they're so timid, is that they did an enormous amount for last year and deserved tons of credit. And it was a complete U-turn from the thinking in Europe before. There is still a lot being done this year. It's just a bit less than last year. And then they think, well, all the forecast is that we're going to grow in the second half, so it should be okay. And maybe it is okay. I just think that the risk profile is so skewed that there's no damage doing too much, and there are lots of damage if you do too little.
Eric Nielsen, Ken Rogoff will join us later. He and Christine Lagarde are on the same page. They look at Bitcoin and Bitcoin-like things as nothing more than a facilitator of criminal activity. Do you link Bitcoin and its future to money laundering and crime, or can it actually go legit?
I thank you for that question. I am completely on Rogoff's and Lagarde's line. This is It's a horrible thing. It uses energy like there's no tomorrow. The site to produce this piece of nothing. We are polluting the solution, polluting the environment with this damn thing. And the only useful thing it is, if that's useful, is for criminal activity. I can see no other reason to use it. It's nothing. It is, but there's a lot of people. Wealth is very isolated in a few bunch of people and areas, and they have problems finding something to invest in. And it's like a lottery ticket for these people. I think it's nothing outside.
Look, I don't want to get you in trouble with the general counsel at UniCredit, but major banks are climbing. I'm going to keep UniCredit out of it. Major banks, a fact is they're climbing on board cryptocurrencies in Bitcoin. Dr. Nielsen, are they making a mistake?
Yes, absolutely. Let me put it this way: if my bank were to do it, I would be very vocal about my opposition to this. It has not been discussed to my knowledge inside. I do not understand why they would do it. A bank is not in the business of selling lottery tickets. It is absolutely absurd. How would a salesperson comply with the regulatory environment of explaining to the buyer what it is you're selling him? It is nothing. There is no underlying asset, right? It has no social use. So I am shocked if European banks would start to trade it. I really would.
Eric Nielsen, thank you so much for your candid comments. He is with UniCredit, their chief economist this morning, and he'll be getting a call from the general counsel here in a matter of minutes as well. With our first word news in New York City, Karina Mitchell.
Okay, Tom, thank you. President Biden plans to issue, a set of executive orders today aimed at fighting the virus. Those orders will reverse or refashion many of Donald Trump's most criticized policies. The president will overhaul and unify the approach to virus testing and use federal powers to stabilize the supply chain for critical medical supplies. He'll also boost the government's ability to provide rapid and fair vaccine distribution. Meanwhile, the administration is mending fences with the World Health Organization. Infectious diseases chief Anthony Fauci pledged the country's commitment to the agency today on a video link. The U.S. will join COVAX, the WHO's multinational effort seeking to deploy virus vaccines around the world. Former President Donald Trump had said the U.S. would exit the WHO. And Mr. Trump's second impeachment trial is still on hold. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi hasn't triggered a proceeding that could slow down the Senate's new Democratic majority and delay confirmation of key Biden administration officials. It is up to Pelosi to decide when she will formally transmit the article of impeachment to the Senate. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Karina Mitchell. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Karina. Now, coming up next, we talk about the inauguration. We talk about the U.S.-UK relationship with Nigel Sheinwald. He's a former British ambassador to the United States. We talk policy. This is Bloomberg.
as the European Union, we know exactly on what side of the table we're sitting. We're sitting on the side of the democracies next to our American friends. And indeed, China is a systemic rival when it comes to the way they look at the individual and human rights. And this is a very clear point here, that here we join forces with our American friends concerning China. But if we look at our competitor China, so the access to the market, for example, well, the Americans have an economic agreement, the Phase 1 agreement with China. China has with the Asian area its economic agreement, but also with other democracies like Australia, Canada, Switzerland. And therefore, I think it is self-explaining that the European Union negotiated a new economic investment agreement, because it's a matter for our investors to have a level playing field and to have access to the Chinese market.
Well, that was Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, on the EU's investment deal with China and working with the Biden administration. Now, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson was among many other world leaders to congratulate Biden on his inauguration. Speaking in Parliament yesterday, he said he looked forward to working closely with him on shared priorities like climate change and transatlantic security. Although, Tom, I have to say the interview that probably stole the day was when a BBC reporter also asked Boris Johnson whether the new president was woke, and it was quite a funny exchange, as we weren't sure whether Boris Johnson understood what it meant, and he definitely didn't want to answer it either.
I do.
Joining us now, not to talk about that, but to talk about policy, is Nigel Scheinwald, King's College London visiting professor in the Department of War Studies and former British ambassador to the U.S. Ambassador Scheinwald, thank you for joining us. When you look at the new world that Joe Biden is looking at, it seems it's more and more polarized, or at least it's a bipolar U.S.-China world. How should he engage with the UK and the EU in the midst of this?
Well, it's certainly an even more disorderly and fragmented world than the one he left as vice president 4 years ago. You're absolutely right on that. Not all of that is down to Donald Trump, but some of it certainly is. I think that he's absolutely right to put his priority on rebuilding America domestically. Most countries in the world, because of the pandemic, for other reasons, are domestically, inwardly focused at the moment. We all know that America can't reinstall itself in a role of global leadership unless there's that confidence and stability at home, which doesn't plainly exist at the moment. So all that is fine. I think that, around the world and here in Europe, I think there'll be enormous relief and welcome for what he said yesterday, rejoining Paris, being prepared to look again at the Iran nuclear deal, rejoining that if the conditions are right. Rejoining the World Health Organization. I think all these things are very important, but I think allies have to step up to the plate as well. And I think what Ursula von der Leyen said was welcome, but I wonder if Europe really has thought through whether it's going to be an active partner for the United States or not. There's this talk of strategic autonomy. Some in France and elsewhere talk about a Europe which is equidistant from America and China. She wasn't talking in those terms, but there are some in Europe who do. And for the UK, plainly, there is a bit of a hangover from Brexit. Americans, like President Biden, think it was a big mistake. I don't think he'll bear a grudge against Boris Johnson for that reason, or for Boris's closeness with President Trump. But Britain has to show that it's going to cooperate with its European partners. That was a gap in the deal before Christmas, and start to behave in a more practically cooperative way with its partners, both in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere.
Ambassador, in 4 years' time, how will you judge or decide on how will you measure success of Joe Biden?
Well, I think primarily, if he's been able to restore a sense of confidence in America, in practical politics, and rebuild the center in American public life. That's a huge challenge, and I would question whether he can get all the way in a presidential term. But he can certainly reverse the slide into violence, into extremism, which was accentuated under Trump. Internationally, I think that things again can't return to a unipolar, straightforward world of 30 years ago. But if there is forward international movement agreed on climate change, this is a huge transformation of the global economy, which is going to take decades. But if it can start in a more concerted way after the Trump blip, then that will be a significant achievement, and I'm sure John Kerry will commit himself to that. And then looking around the world, restoring balance into the relationship with China. What the rest of the world wants is predictability, and combining that sense of competition and cooperation in a smart way with China, rather than this oscillation between a love affair and a trade war, which we've had for the last 4 years. And I think the allies can cooperate in that and help with that, because it's a shared burden. But you need to find that middle ground, which can enable coalition building to begin. And then selectively, looking at the problems like Iran, Yemen, around the world, I think Tony Blinken and his team have a real chance to restore some sense of practical work on those issues, to take us away from the confrontations of recent times.
How will Boris Johnson work with Joe Biden?
I would hope fine. I mean, it doesn't look on the surface like, in personal terms, a match made in heaven. They're very, very different in their personalities and outlook. But it's in the job description of a British Prime Minister to get on with and bond as much as possible with an American president, whoever there are. And there have been some unlikely bonds and links which have been created. It wasn't written in the stars that Tony Blair and George W. Bush would form a close relationship, but it happened. So I think it can be done. Biden, over 4 decades in the Senate, knows about the UK. He knows about Europe. He knows the contribution the UK makes. He knows the size of our economy and the example of our armed forces and so on. So I think the foundations are there, but I think we have to, as I say, we have to get over this inconvenience, as it were, over Brexit, prove that we've got it behind us, and that we are interested in getting back to the Britain that Biden will remember, of working issues smartly and actively, and in cooperation with all our partners, and not getting bogged down again in the debates over Brexit, which we've had for the past few years.
Nigel Scheinwald, thank you so much for joining us. King's College London visiting professor there in the Department of War Studies and former British ambassador to the U.S. Now, make sure you pick up the latest issue of Bloomberg Business Week, featuring 50 companies to watch out for. It's our 50 best. We'll be looking and speaking to the chief executives of one of those companies, Jeff Lawson from Twilio. That interview a little bit later on today, 10 p.m. in London, 5 p.m. in New York. And this is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
We explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
I wish the new administration great luck and great success. I think they'll have great success. They have the foundation to do something really spectacular. So just a goodbye. We love you. We will be back in some form. Have a good life. We will see you soon.
The former president of the United States speaking there on the way to Florida, and as a symbolism of the flags not only seen yesterday but in recent days, really speaks volumes about these two administrations. One red, white, and blue and highly visible, and the other more stark and simplistic, more minimalist. Matthew Winkler of Bloomberg, our editor-in-chief emeritus, is acclaimed for density of paragraphs. He's written a 7, 8, 9 paragraph jewel looking back at Trump economics, Trump performance, the muscular results of President Trump. And it makes for careful reading, not only about President Trump and President Biden, but going back to James Earl Carter. Matt Winkler joins us this morning. Matt, I want to go right to the trade deficit, the relationship with China. How did President Trump do in narrowing the trade deficit?
It's good to be with you. You know, for all the bombast against globalization, during his first 3 years as president, the trade deficit climbed to a record $1.67 trillion. Now that surpasses the similar period deficits for Obama, for George W. Bush, and also for Clinton. And our data, by the way, is census, U.S. Census data, and it goes back to 1992. You know, so by the end of the Trump era, if you will, we have a really dubious outcome, which is he has really nothing to show for the policies that he engendered. You know, he's at this point worse than everybody except George W. Bush, who you know presided over the worst recession since the Great Depression. So, yeah, I mean, he has nothing to show for what he's done with China.
With the wonderful work that you and Shinpei do, the quantitative work that you do, a completely unfair question this morning. We assume that President Biden will raise taxes. Can he place those tax increases all on business and corporations, or does he have to bring it over to the so-called wealthy?
So it's a really great question, and something that, you know, is only touched upon recently in a lot of commentary, including ours, which is the last time really a U.S. president raised taxes significantly was Bill Clinton in the 1990s. And you could say that was the best economy in the United States in the 20th century, because in that period, of course, we had the peace dividend, but the divide between the have-nots and the haves, the inequality gap, we call it, narrowed significantly for the first time. And that was because Bill Clinton, under a lot of pressure, would balance the budget, would create a surplus. He did it by raising taxes. And by the end of the decade, the U.S. was in an enviable position economically, aside from the dot-com bubble bursting. So, you know, that's a good example. If you recall that election of 2000, everybody was arguing about what to do with the Social Security surplus, if you can believe it.
Matt, what about the Midwest manufacturing? I mean, this was, I guess, a linchpin of what, you know, Donald Trump tried to do. Did he revive it at all?
Well, that's going to be difficult because that was a long-term trend. I mean, and that had less to do really with, per se, anything in the U.S. and more to do with the fact that, globalization was a force and companies were allowed to pursue labor wherever they could get it that was cheaper. Right. And it wasn't just the U.S., it was everywhere. Well, and so, that was a long-term trend. Now, yeah, you can do things to invest in clean energy, and that will create high-paying jobs. Janet Yellen
Matt, we're going
yesterday.
to have to leave it there. We're out of time. We will continue this important discussion. Mr. Winkler, Editor-in-Chief Emeritus of Bloomberg. Stay with us. Good morning.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Biden Jr. do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
This morning, and I mean early morning, President Biden starts the day at 5 a.m. What's that about? The virus, it has prevailed. Record death in Germany and Mexico. New York City is near out of vaccine. Biden will, quote, convert vaccines into vaccinations. The bulls, well, they've prevailed. Stocks elevate, yield stable as Senator Schumer considers stimulus. And poetry prevails, and yet the dawn is ours as Amanda Gorman gives America a gift outright. Good morning, everyone. On the day after, no, we don't have Bruce Springsteen. I was asleep for Springsteen. Francine saw it all. John Legend at Lincoln Memorial as well. Francine, a day of celebration in America for all Americans. But this morning, the work starts.
Yeah, I have to say yesterday, actually, the inauguration was beautiful, Tom, and, you know, really the youngest poet laureate ever in the U.S. really captured the imagination and the grace of many people around the world. I would say, Tom, yes, it's a full working day for the Biden administration, but they actually started yesterday with signing of 15 executive orders, and it's very clear that after the celebrations, it's whether they will be able to get through what they want through Congress, and so you see the division split on whether really President Biden can reach across the aisle.
Well, the distractions of getting the cabinet fully approved, the distraction of a pending impeachment and Senate trial for Mr. Trump, and of course the policy, the first days of policy in Washington. Our policy is to give you a data check. Let's do that right now. Equities advance off of the advance yesterday. I believe it's a bull market. I'm looking for an entry point. Futures up 6. Dow futures up 29. I'm giving you the Dow level for John Farrow, 31,125. And the VIX is telling 21.42 on the VIX. That's a different statistic. That's a bull market statistic. Be interesting to see how that acts in the next day or so. Yields quiescent, and I'd notice also dollar quieter. I know, Francine, really interesting to see what euro sterling's doing.
Yeah, so I'm focused on euro sterling. Again, the European Central Bank policy decision is due out later today, so maybe they'll also talk a bit about euro level, although I know a lot of economists, including Eric Nielsen of UniCredit, just doesn't want Christine Lagarde to weigh in on things like that. Oil dipping, pessimism over demand offset really by a weaker dollar. Overall, if you look at European shares are higher, led by tech, and as you say, Tom, U.S. futures also edging higher.
Right now, let's get right to it. We have a packed hour for you. We're first going to go to Washington, and our Emily Wilkins, who has the advantage of her focus on the legislative branch after the inauguration, all turned to Congress. Emily Wilkins, what will Senator Schumer do today to move legislation and move his Democratic majority forward?
Well, Schumer's got a lot on his plate. He has to continue to confirm members of Biden's cabinet. He needs to start trying to whip members, see what the interest is for passing a $1.9 trillion coronavirus spending deal. And also, don't forget, these articles of impeachment are going to come over from the House to the Senate at some point. And at that point, the Senate's going to have to go into impeachment trial mode.
When they go into impeachment trial mode, then do you assume everything else stops?
That actually depends on the Senate. They need to sort of figure out whether or not they're going to do something like we saw last year where they did business in the morning and then a trial in the afternoon. That's going to require a number of senators to agree to that format. And if Republicans don't like it, as we saw from some last night, that could potentially hold up some critical legislative work that's on Biden's agenda for his first 100 days.
Emily, good morning, also from London. What happens to the $1.9 trillion package?
So we've already heard from a couple of moderate Republicans who are concerned about such a package. They're worried that it's too much spending, particularly after the U.S. just passed that $900 billion bill back in December. And so there seems to be some concern among more moderate Republicans, individuals that the Biden administration was hoping to get on board because they'd like to pass this bill in a bipartisan fashion. I think it's sort of, now we go to negotiations, we go to talking back and forth, seeing if there is a way to get these senators on board with the deal. If not, Democrats might have to use a particular wonky procedure known as budget reconciliation and pass it on their own.
Emily, I know the inauguration was quite emotional. It was actually beautifully executed, no matter what party you're from. Emily, something that touched me was actually seeing the three former presidents, talks among each other about unity. President Obama, President Clinton, and President Bush. What symbolically does that mean for America right now?
There were a number of Republicans yesterday who showed up in the name of unity, including some lawmakers who actually voted against certifying the Electoral College votes for Biden. And so you did sort of see a number of individuals come out, like you mentioned, George W. Bush. You saw former Republican Speaker Paul Ryan. And when they were asked why they were here today, unity was that overall theme. There's kind of a sense within both parties that they would like things to maybe get back to a little more normal after the insurrection at the Capitol 2 weeks ago.
Well, Emily Wilkins, thank you so much. Towards towards a more normal day today for you, our congressional reporter from the streets of Washington this morning. Futures up 7, Dow Futures up 35. We have a wonderful set of hours set up for surveillance this morning. Ken Rogoff will join us. Really looking forward to that. Jeannie Zaino out with a wonderful new book. We're really going to dive into her look at what this strange word democracy is. But first, the pulse of America. There is truly no one better to talk to than Mohammed Yunus of Gallup. We do that next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
Continues to be, recovering well. And with the opening up that was decided at the last 5-year plan, that is a golden opportunity for many international banks.
So we'll look to double our footprint across IB and also wealth management and asset management in the 3 to 5 year time frame.
Growth outlook structurally is very strong. But it does need to consolidate and allow time to help the share price appreciation to move more in sync with the growth.
So China can avoid further decoupling if they stop these inappropriate actions.
But at the moment, we really want to see the dust settle first on international relationships, on China's role in the global economy.
I don't see a likelihood of a big change in the policy with the change of administrations.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flicked the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean? Combustion engines get electrified.
Good morning, everyone. Bloomberg Surveillance. Francine Lacroix in London. I'm Tom Keene in New York. I've really been looking forward to this discussion. Mohammed Yunus is with Gallup, and they do a wonderful polling of the pulse of America. Rather than look back, which we've been doing so much with Mohammed, now an effort to look forward with his great skills, his great polling. How do you define a honeymoon, Mohammed? I mean, if President Biden has a moneyhoon, if he has a honeymoon, how do you poll for that? How do you figure that out?
It's very traditionally done with the approval rating. So most presidents, with the exception of President Trump, have seen that honeymoon period where their approval rating really climbs high and then settles down to where it ends up being most of their term. Usually that's assumed to be giving the president a chance. What's interesting with President Biden is that he actually is coming in at a relatively strong point. His favorability rating, which really operates as an approval rating before a president takes office, is actually really high for him. He's at 57. When he was elected vice president, he was at about 31. So it really shows you he's really climbed and stepped up to a much more positive place in the minds of more Americans. The transition has also had positive approval ratings. 68% of people said that they approve of the way that the transition was handled. It's not as high as Barack Obama's, which was at 83%, but certainly much higher than Donald Trump's at 44%.
Normalcy, what an interesting word. We're going to talk to Jeannie Zaino about this in a bit here, but does America want normalcy?
Look, America right now is highly dissatisfied with the state of affairs in the country. We take the mood of the nation every January. We've done so over the past 20 years. Right now, 11% of Americans are satisfied with the way things are going in the United States. 88% dissatisfied. It is a record high in people saying they're dissatisfied with the moral climate in the country. 81% say they're dissatisfied with it. 73% dissatisfied with the way system of government and how government works. 41%, that's a almost 20-point jump, now say they're dissatisfied with the state of opportunity for people to work hard and get ahead. So there are real problems that America's facing in terms of satisfaction. But when we ask Americans about the most important problems, it's really clear what they want this new team to focus on. 29%, the highest rate of most important problem, say poor government, poor leadership. 22% mention COVID. 9% mention the economy, which is of course related. 12% mention unifying the country as the most important problem. 10% race relations. So as you see, very little of that has to do with sort of looking back, and a lot of it really has to do with looking forward, attacking the economic challenges and the public health crisis that the country is currently facing.
Mohammed, how many people in the U.S. believe this was a fair election, won fairly?
Well, I think the critical question is how many Republicans believe it wasn't, because that's really the question out there. It's been proven that it was a fair election. Per the latest polls, about 7 in 10 Republicans have questions about the outcome of the election. What's really key is, will that change as time passes? Or another way to look at it is, will President Biden be able to build that goodwill? He starts off at a better place than Donald Trump. 27% of Republicans currently approve of the approach he's taken with the transition. 27% of Republicans compared to 13% of Democrats for Trump. So he's making a little bit of edgeway. But these next 6 months are absolutely critical to see whether or not this hyper-partisan environment, not to be overcome, but certainly set aside to deal with some of these national challenges.
And this actually goes to the point that I want to ask you. So the Biden transition approval remains high at about 68%. Do you have a breakdown of whether, Republicans feel, how do they have him in terms of approval?
Absolutely. So currently 27% of Republicans approve of that transition, 71% of independents, 96% of Democrats. To compare Donald Trump, it was 87% of Republicans, 33% of independents, and 13% of Democrats. So it's not like President Obama, when he came in, he had 72% approval of his transition from Republicans, came in a very, very high moment emotionally in America. So he's nowhere near there, but he's certainly about 15 points higher than where President Trump was with the opposing party at this point.
Mohammed, this is way too premature, but I love having you on. How do we do with third parties in America? I mean, I always think of H. Ross Perot, but give me some vision here on a third partiness of America.
That's an excellent question, and it's actually something we were just discussing on our team yesterday. What we find traditionally is really interesting, Tom. 2 things Americans have been overwhelmingly in favor of. That's term limits for Congress and a third party. The challenge is, how do you pull that off, and where does a third party come from? And that's why what happens with the GOP in this next year to 2 years is really critical. Legally, constitutionally, in the way that the electoral system works, it's very difficult, actually, to establish a third party. But if there's ever a time to really ask that question, it's certainly now. And I want to remind us, we're really focused on the GOP. The DNC, the Democratic Party, also has a major identity challenge currently unfolding within it. Right now, they're unified because they're unifying behind a new president, but those challenges are there as well. So when you think about a third party, don't only think about things coming from the right, but also consider things coming from the left as well in this country.
What are you looking at in February of this year? Give us a look forward to what Gallup wants to know from America.
I think the most important thing is how are people experiencing this unprecedented crisis of COVID? Do they feel like they're getting access to vaccinations? Do they feel like getting back to work is something that is going to be achievable in the coming months or maybe even weeks for some? Americans are very apolitical naturally in a time of hyper-political focus and partisanship. The average American, based on all our data, is very focused on their job, their well-being, their family. Mental health is at a record low in this country. So Americans really want their lives to get back to normal. And they're looking for ways to do that. I think the new team this morning has a lot of work to dig this country out of the hole. It isn't, at least in terms of how people feel about how things are going.
Gallup editor-in-chief, thank you so much. As always, Mohammed Yunus there. Now, coming up on What You Miss, Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate and Columbia University economics professor. I know they'll talk about the Biden policies going forward. That interview, 4:30 p.m. in New York, that's 9:30 p.m. in London, and this is Bloomberg.
Y lo más increíble es eso, no solo estás sintiendo frontalmente, sino que en la espalda también, entonces a lo mejor estás jugando y sientes que por detrás te pasa algo, entonces...
Y ver cómo te tiran algún objeto, cómo notas la sensación, ¿no? Como que te golpean a ti. Yo creo que hace que empatices mucho con los personajes y que sea todo mucho más real.
Generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
This is America's day. This is democracy's day. The will of the people has been heard, and the will of the people has been heeded. We've learned again that democracy is precious. Democracy is fragile. And at this hour, my friends, democracy has prevailed.
The President of the United States speaking on democracy. This is what we love to do at Bloomberg Surveillance, folks. This goes back to the very beginnings of Bloomberg on the economy. We are now going to give you a treatise on this strange word, democracy. The book is American Democracy in Crisis, The Case for Rethinking Madisonian Government. And full disclosure, there's no pictures. The movie rights haven't been sold. This is an academic heavyweight effort by the wonderful Jeannie Sheehan Zaino. We're thrilled that she could join us today, of course, contributing so much to our political effort today. Here's a snippet from the book. So what is a democracy? That's a tough question. I'd get a quality C, I'm sure. Perhaps the most well-known definition of democracy is the one often mistakenly attributed to Lincoln: government of the people, by the people, for the people. At the time, the slogan was one that served more to incite one's emotions with a sense of self-control over the government. And then the critical idea of, by, and for. Professor Zainal, thank you so much for joining us. The president's speech yesterday on democracy, he's keeping it simple for America and for the world. What does this prevail mean?
You know, I was so struck by the focus on democracy prevailing because it's fragile. We have got to guard against this, you know, the turmoil that we've seen over the last few weeks, and of course, all the crises. And that word fragility is one I use consistently through the book, and it absolutely describes a democracy. It's like a body. It's like a human being. Relationships, they're fragile. You've got to consistently be making sure they're healthy. And that's why I say we have to rethink, not revise necessarily, but rethink our democracy.
Let's go up the Hudson River right now to Martin Van Buren, 18 whatever, a million years ago, and the invention of modern political parties. George Washington was petrified that we would get to this baneful sense of parties. He mentioned it in the farewell address, which everybody should read every word of. Our party system now, is it something that doesn't work? Is it broken?
It is broken, but the way that they structured our system, it's necessary. And that's why political scientists like me have consistently talked about the need for responsible, healthy parties. What they did is they structured the system so they put so much division and separation in it, getting things done like a COVID relief bill becomes terribly difficult. And so because of that, you need any effort to bring us together, which political parties are. So the founders absolutely deplored parties, but created a system in which they were necessary. And as we were just talking off air about Hamilton, of course, very early, Hamilton realized he needed to join forces with like-minded people to get things done because the system is so fractured.
The tension here, and Francine lives this every day, Italy's falling apart once again for the 4,000th time since World War II with 42 parties. They can't do a coalition, etc. Do we in the future, whether it's Mr. Trump or others, damage America with a third party or not? I mean, is it healthy to have a third party within our democracy?
We won't, in the way we are structured historically, we won't have a third party. It'll be eaten up by the two major parties.
Like it has been every time.
Like it has been every time. And so parties are not a be-all and end-all. They are one potential solution. There's other structural solutions. We could think about revising the Constitution, and the goal would be to diminish the amount of division in the system so that the system can be more responsive to majority will. And that's really where I'm coming from. The framers in Madison were so focused on protection of liberty, they completely neglected responsiveness and accountability. And so what I talk about is sort of evening up those scales.
Jean, good morning. When you talk about distrust of American government, when you talk about public disenchantment with American government, is this the government or is this the perception of people because of the narrative in certain media? Is it social media? Is it fake news that fuels this feeling?
And it's fascinating because the president was talking yesterday in his speech about truth. I think that is an element of it. But what I argue is that we can't be surprised if people are frustrated with the government when the government doesn't respond to crises over long periods of time. So, Francine, it was fascinating. I was rereading Treasury Secretary, old Treasury Secretary C. Douglas Dillon's piece from 1982. He talked at Tufts about all the challenges that were not being addressed in the early 1980s. And they were exactly the same things not addressed today. The deficit, which I know you talk about all the time, gun control, health care, on these crises unaddressed. And so my argument is that people become frustrated and then they seek saviors, they seek outsiders, they seek people to save us from a government that's not being responsive. And so I argue if the government would be just mildly more responsive when the majority wants something like lower drug prices, for instance, then we would have less frustration in the system.
Jane, when you look at, for example, healthcare, there was Obamacare. There are a number of, like, it feels as an outsider that a lot of sometimes the solutions, it really splits the U.S. It's 50% of the people are for it and 50% are against it.
And healthcare is a great example. We've had a healthcare crisis in this country for over 100 years now. And Barack Obama and the Congress finally did come in. But as you and I know, the bill that ultimately passed was not the bill that Barack Obama talked about as candidate Obama. It was not the bill that he wanted. It was a watered down version of what he had initially wanted. And why is it watered down? Because it has to go through a structured, fractured process.
Professor Zaino, thank you so much, and we look for her continuing political coverage. The book, American Democracy in Crisis. Next, Rogoff of Harvard. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
Такие компьютеры открывают новые возможности детям с двигательными ограничениями, которые закованы в своем теле, еще и не могут разговаривать. Да? Они не могут никому объяснить, что они хотят. Да? А тут получается...